There's been a very spirited debate today in the United States Senate about how all of this will be paid for and how it will affect the national budget. We're joined now by the Democratic leader in the United States Senate, that is Tom Daschle, who the other day was the target of some very sharp Republican criticism when he said he was saddened by the failure of the president to find a diplomatic solution to this war. But early this morning, Senator Daschle, you made another speech about the situation in Iraq and the involvement of the American military.
Well, Tom, once we go to war, I think it's critical for us to unite behind our troop effort, behind the war effort, behind the commander-in-chief. Later on today, we'll be offering a resolution which will give us an opportunity officially to do that, but many of us have begun expressing those sentiments as early as this morning.
What about the debate on the Senate floor? I was listening to some of it. Senator Lautenberg, Senator Clinton from New York all had some pretty sharp things to say about the administration's approach on financing this war and dealing with the federal budget, continuing to insist that we'll have the tax cuts that they have put before the Congress.
Well, that's part of the ongoing budget debate that we've had now all week long. We're in the final stages of completing our work on the budget resolution. There isn't any request within the budget resolution for the costs of the war. And what we're simply saying is that you really can't debate the budget. You can't fully appreciate the magnitude of whatever budgetary challenges we face unless you know the cost of the war. That cost will be known to us later on. We thought it ought to be done in the context of the budget resolution itself.
Has no one from the administration shared with you what they expect the war will cost?
They have not at this point. We know that there are various analyses that have been provided to the administration with regard to the costs, but at least so far they've not shared them with Congress.
And what about the debate on the president's tax cut? How will that be affected by this war activity and the estimates that go as high as $1 billion a day to finance the war?
Well, Tom, that's a very significant concern of ours. There is about $1.5 trillion tax cut in this budget resolution, and we are concerned about the implications of tax cuts Senator, as we consider the cost of the war itself.
Senator, we're going to interrupt you there because we're going to go to live pictures of Baghdad now, where there is, as you can see in the skies over Baghdad, air defense activity, anti-aircraft fire beginning to light up the skies. It's a little after 9 Baghdad time. This very well could be the beginning of a campaign called Shock and Awe, a major air campaign that Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld said today the world has never witnessed in terms of its ferocity. And he gave that warning to the Iraqi people.
In the air that as of now no sounds of bombs falling. Was that an aircraft over there? Yeah. We do see an aircraft, what seemed to be an aircraft in the sky. Maybe it was a missile. An explosion in the sky. NBC. I don't have your audio, but I'm continuing to talk to you from here.
Go ahead, Peter, if you can hear me. This is Tom Brokaw.
We are again just standing here on our balcony, trying to figure out what is going on. But clearly a nervous city. 15 minutes ago, air raid warnings. Now 5 minutes of anti-aircraft fire in the distance. We can see explosions of anti-aircraft weapons in the sky.
Hello, NBC, do you hear us? Do you hear us here in Baghdad? Do you hear us here in Baghdad? We are not hearing anything.
Yes, we do hear you in Baghdad.
All right, great.
Just continue, Peter Arnett.
Yeah, Tom, that was my producer, Charles Poe, a very brave young man with my team here. As I said earlier, 15 minutes ago, warning sirens in Baghdad. Just the last 5 minutes, heavy anti-aircraft fire into the sky. Right now, in the distance, we cannot hear the explosions, but we can't hear the explosions, but we can see multiple anti-aircraft explosions rockets going into the sky. We don't hear the sounds of planes. But hang on a minute, I'll check with my cameraman.
All right, as you do that, Peter, I'm going to get an assessment of where some of our expert analysts are here, General Michael Short and Monty Miggs and others. That appears to be an explosion that has occurred in the distance on the horizon. I'm not sure the direction there in Baghdad. It's a sprawling city. About 5 million people live in Baghdad. Quite an elegant city at one time, and portions of it remain that. It's always a surprise to a lot of outsiders. It's the most developed middle class in the Middle East, probably. And the most striking architecture, of course, are all the presidential palaces and the monuments that Saddam Hussein has had erected to himself. Although in recent years, he's also erected what he called the mother of all mosques, as he tries to reach out to the faithful in the Middle East and portray himself as a much more religious man. When he appeared this morning on television in Iraq, he referred to the Quran and morning prayers, but he is widely seen, even in that part of the world, as a very secular figure. He uses religion only when it's to his advantage. Okay, let's hear Peter Arnett again.
Again, multiple anti-aircraft bursts sweeping. Now we hear the sounds of aircraft low over the city. Aircraft low over the city. Big explosion near the presidential palace. You will hear those explosions now. It looks somewhere near the information ministry. Explosion. Much smoke in the sky. Much smoke in the sky. It is clear the major attack is beginning on the city. One building seems completely destroyed by a bomb. Again, the smoke rising. And another explosion we're hearing. We are here opposite the presidential palace. This is 5 to 6 miles of practice riverfront at which there are, we are under the impression, 5 to 10 targets. But right now, the one we do see...
All right, as we listen to Peter Arnett reporting directly from a hotel room in Baghdad, we will tell you that at the Pentagon and at the White House, this is the beginning of a campaign of shock and awe, an unparalleled air attack designed to do great damage to the leadership of Iraq, also to have an enormous psychological effect not only on the military but on the people of Iraq, to know that they cannot win this war. Ground troops, if they're not already moving, will be shortly from the south and Kuwait up toward Baghdad. Other troops could be arriving from the north. NBC's Jim Miklashevsky at the Pentagon, what can you tell us?
Well, Tom, U.S. military officials do tell NBC News that this is the beginning of the shock and awe campaign. According to one official, this is going to be the entire 9 yards. The initial plan for shock and awe had called for some 600 cruise missiles, thousands of bombs, all aimed at military leadership targets, military infrastructure targets in and around Baghdad in the first 24 to 48 hours of any air war. It's unclear as to how soon the U.S. military would start moving on the ground. We did see earlier artillery barrages across the Kuwaiti border aimed at the 51st Mechanized Division of the Iraqi military in southern Iraq, thought to be the toughest of the regular Iraqi military troops in the south. The war is on at full bore at this time, and this bombing is expected to continue, Tom, for several hours.
All right, thanks very much, NBC Jim Miklashevsky. As we continue to look at these live pictures, the consortium of television agencies in Baghdad and Al Jazeera, you'll see that Arabic logo in the upper right-hand corner. That is the Arabic news channel service out of Qatar. They have more correspondents and more cameras there than anyone. Smoke around some of the buildings, but the striking thing remains that the power still is on in Baghdad. There was a lot of talk about a so-called E-bomb that would immobilize the
of the things we're going to have to train ourselves, all of us here, is that the shock and awe may not be a function of the fireworks display and the sort of kinetic energy that's displayed. The shock and awe has to do with precision applied.
It's including the Iraqi television station system, which was a target in the first Gulf War. The Information Ministry was not a target in the second Gulf War, in the first Gulf War. This time around, it's been very clear that many international media have been working out of there, and we were working in the Information Ministry earlier today, and but we cannot confirm that that is the target of the first bomb. It is certainly very near that ministry.
Peter, what about
beyond that?
Go ahead.
Yeah, back to you, Tom.
No, I was just going to say, are you seeing any damage to roadways and bridges? Those were targets in the past, but they're picking out, it sounds to me, like specific buildings.
Clearly specific buildings. We have seen 2 that have been destroyed. We've heard explosions in 2 or 3 other areas. The presidential palace itself remains intact. One building in the presidential compound has been destroyed. We did hear a major explosion to the south, to the southwest of that building. We can't eyeball it here from here. And clearly another one of the command and control structures. Clearly many targets to the western edge of the city, because there was enormous anti-aircraft fire earlier, away in the distance. Beyond that, there are no other targets. The Defense Ministry intact, communication centers on the east side of the river where we are so far unhit. So you don't have a similar pattern to the first Gulf War. Clearly they, not at this point, but of course this is just the beginning of what is promises to be, of course, a huge bombing campaign, Tom.
And General Michael Short, who is here with us, how does it work? They lay down the cruise missiles, the Tomahawks, and then the tacticals come in behind that?
Tom, I think cruise missiles, again, air-launched and sea-launched, to take out his eyes, to blind the Iraqi air defense system so they cannot respond to either stealth assets or conventional assets. Then rapidly after that, stealth assets, probably redundancy on some of the radars. As an air commander, I'd want to put a couple of rounds on each of the radars that I was most concerned about on their defensive systems. Then with stealth in and back out, then I put in conventional assets, believing I've beaten them down enough that I can put aluminum airplanes overhead Baghdad.
All right, let's go to NBC. Jim Miklaszewski at the Pentagon, who has some more on just what we've been talking about here. Jim?
Tom, U.S. government officials are now describing a somewhat different plan than the huge, massive bombardment of Baghdad in what they would call the shock and awe campaign. That was the original campaign underway, and I guess it could be best described perhaps as shock and pause. It was suggested to us that there may be waves of airstrikes now that are more incremental, aimed at specific leadership targets. As Peter Arnett described the areas being struck in this latest wave of airstrikes from U.S. warplanes and missiles, those are aimed at the Baghdad elite and leadership targets. According to officials, the bombing last night aimed at this bunker that supposedly contained Saddam Hussein and senior members of his regime. That was a very direct message aimed at Saddam Hussein. That was followed up today by messages from both Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld and Ari Fleischer during their briefings here in Washington. What's interesting about those briefings is that they are beamed into Iraq via airborne radio broadcasts through military aircraft, and the message from both of them today was very strong. Essentially, give up while you've got the chance. Take down Saddam Hussein and avoid an all-out war. This is these airstrikes are apparently designed now to reinforce that latest message. Meanwhile, still no indication that despite the artillery barrages being aimed across the border at the 51st Mechanized Unit in southern Iraq, that any of those ground troops have actually begun to move into the country of Iraq. Tom?
All right, thanks very much, NBC. Jim Miklaszewski. Kelly O'Donnell, who is at CENTCOM, the Central Command Headquarters in Qatar, is reporting the sources there are saying this may be going on for a period of unknown time, but the assault that Secretary Rumsfeld described earlier as a, quote, force, scope, and scale that has not been seen before will be unmistakable, and this is not yet it. So the battlefield plan still is unfolding. The exact dimensions of it are still not entirely clear to us. General Monty Meigs has been thinking a lot about shock and awe as a battlefield strategy and as a concept for the wars of the 21st century. General?
Well, I think we got to be careful with words like huge. Remember, what I think we're about here is using a lot of very small strikes to take out very specific pieces of the system in which the cumulative effect is devastating to the enemy's ability in any way to react or control his forces. And that's when his will starts to deteriorate. And so it's not a big bang type of attack from my assessment of it. It's more a series of small bangs that crescendo, and then everything becomes paralyzed and the enemy starts to get frantic.
All right, we're going to take a look at the tape that we saw earlier from Baghdad. And I'm going to ask General Short to join in on this as well. In 1991, there was an awful lot of just filling the sky with anti-aircraft stuff. They didn't know quite what they were shooting at. They were just filling it up. Is that what it looks like here as well?
It does to me, Tom. This is the hope that we'll put enough lead in the sky and someone will fly through it. I doubt that much of this is guided, because to guide it, you've got to turn your radar on, and to turn your radar on in Baghdad today is to die, because there are F-16s and F-18s with a harm and a radiation missile waiting for someone to turn their radars on.
And back to what General Meigs was just talking about, shock and awe, surgical strikes, first stage. Take a look, see what happens with the military command structure. It also sends a message to the Iraqi people. And they get a response, not just militarily, but maybe politically within the command structure, right?
That's right. And I think actually Secretary Rumsfeld's presentation today, given the way that was paced and focused directly as if he was talking to the Iraqi people, wouldn't surprise me if it was up on commando solo and being pumped through all those one-frequency radios as a part of this thing.
I think we're sending the message, clearly we can hit whatever we want to hit, whenever we want to hit it. This is not something where we can only come at you for 2 hours. We'll only be here at night. I expect to see us bombing in the daytime after the first night of attacks. And as General Meigs said, we will be selective. But the overall impact, after about 24 hours, they've got to look around and say, a lot of things that were dear to us are gone, and we can do nothing about it.
And at the same time, they're hearing in Arabic language on those one-frequency radios. And when I've been in Baghdad, a lot of people do have shortwave radios as well. They're hearing the BBC and the Voice of America and other outlets. And they're realizing that this time there is no exit strategy for it.
Exactly. This isn't going to stop until you cause it to stop by removing your leadership.
And the thing we often forget about these societies, the word gets around the street very, very, very quickly. We saw that in Bosnia.
But the fact is that in this case, the people of Iraq, the general rank and file, ordinary people, have been powerless to deal with him because he is so tightly surrounded by his standards, very sophisticated security apparatus.
But I think Rumsfeld spoke to them when he said, don't go to work, stay in your houses, we're not after you, we're after the leadership. And we're not going to bomb areas where we have large domestic populations. My guess is there will be some targets in heavily populated areas that we will choose not to strike, although they would be of value because of the risk of arming civilians.
We were just watching some more explosions there. This is live pictures both from NBC and Al Jazeera. Buildings in Baghdad going up as the attack continues. These Tomahawk missiles are really extraordinary weapons.
They are.
They'd make a right turn at the corner that they want to make a right turn at, go up a little higher, then go down lower, and then just drop down.
Exactly.
And they become an unexpected and very violent visitor.
Yes, and the same thing with the air-launched cruise missile.
How much better are they now than they were 10 years ago, the Tomahawks?
Tom, to me, the biggest thing is they now have the global positioning system in it. The Navy has an option to shoot a 1,000-pound unitary round or the cluster bombs that you and I discussed earlier. So they have a variety of targets they can strike. In the past, they had some trouble with hardened targets, not now with a 1,000-pound penetrator. And the GPS guidance puts them right where they want to be.
And what about the capacity of the Iraqis to defend against an incoming Tomahawk?
No question. You can shoot it down with AAA because they are visible, they are not supersonic, and you can to some degree predict the routes. So I think we will lose some to AAA. There's no question about that.
All right, that's a launch of a Tomahawk that we just watched there. That's how they take off. They fly 550 miles an hour, go for a long way. Most of these are going to be coming, do you think, from the Persian Gulf or from the Mediterranean?
I think from the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, Tom. I think the trip from the Mediterranean through Turkish airspace, I don't think we want to cut through Syrian airspace. There's just no reason to do that. That's a long trip, and I think most of the shooters, as I understand it, were moved from the Mediterranean down to the Red Sea.
What we're looking now is central Baghdad. There's a hotel there where most of the reporters are, and a lot of the cameras are positioned there. It's a hotel. It's not the famous Al Rashid, which has President George Bush the 41st embedded in the tile, so people walk over his face.
Elevator. We had Iraqis say, "Don't take the elevator. It often stops. Walk up the stairs."
Tom, David made a point just a moment ago that's worth understanding for the viewing public. Is he said it's dangerous to be on the roof because of all the AAA going up. All that stuff goes up, explodes, creates shrapnel, has to come back down again. There will be a lot of damage and a lot of death in Baghdad from AAA that the Iraqis have put into the air that has to come back down someplace.
Well, we hope that the people of Iraq, who are in many instances the innocent victims of all of this, having been through 2 wars now, are in their homes. We do know that many of them made preparations, that they began stockpiling food several months ago. They began to make arrangements for getting water out of the Tigris River if necessary. They were building clay ovens in their yards so that they could cook. So we do hope that those people who are, as we say, the victims of all of this are staying in their homes, and a good many of them have already left and gone to the country, so to speak. This is still a tribal country in many ways.
But Tom, you can't underestimate the fatalism of the Iraqi population about that. In 1991, I had an Iraqi shopkeeper, which I made an idle comment. It must have been awful to be here during the bombing. He said, no, not at all. After the first night of attack, we understood your accuracy, and we went to the roof to watch it. We love fireworks, which is absolutely true. Every holiday in Iraq is celebrated with tremendous fireworks. Not everyone understands or believes that their name is on a piece of shrapnel.
What goes up has to come down.
Yeah, but I was also, I encountered that same attitude, David, but what I could not penetrate this time, or what I couldn't persuade them of, it was going to be different, that they're coming all the way to Baghdad this time. I think that they've gotten a kind of mental conditioning. We can survive war and the city will stay intact.
Well, Tom, if I can just say something, I think the brilliance of beginning this campaign at 9:15 in the evening as opposed to 2:30 when we did in 1991, and running it in waves, is the people whose attitude we want to change are the people who are in the inner circle of Saddam and have the possibility of removing him. They've got a long night ahead to think whether he is more dangerous to them than the coalition forces, and they should remove him. It's quite clear we would like to win this war without destroying the Iraqi military and putting at risk the lives of our men and women as well.
Well, that is going on in Iraq and Baghdad. There are protests against the war going on around the world as well. In San Francisco, about 200 protesters are in a kind of guerrilla movement throughout the city. A number of them have been arrested as they attempt to stop traffic, and there are protests in Europe and Asia as well against this war. The Germans, the French, the Russians have all, within their governments, spoken out strongly against the military action. Kofi Annan said that he regretted the fact that it came to war, but then he made an appeal for humanitarian purposes because the UN will have to get deeply involved in the refugee crisis that will grow out of this, and also the whole challenge of feeding the people. This is in South Korea. The South Korean government has come out in favor of the war. In Britain, the United States has had no stronger ally. The United States government has had no stronger ally than Tony Blair, but his own party has been deeply divided. The situation in Russia, President Putin today saying he thought it was not necessary to have military action. He has been talking with President Bush, and Ari Fleischer said today that in fact that they expect that the relationship between Russia and the United States will survive the very deep differences over the necessity to go to war against Iraq. Senior U.S. officials are now saying that the Special Security Organization run by Qusay Hussein and the Presidential Secretary run by Abd Hamid Mahmoud, Saddam's chief of staff, were both hit hard in the initial round of bombing. David Kay is nodding his head.
I think they're excellent targets. They certainly deserve it. It also is interesting. That will send a psychological... These are two of the most feared men in Baghdad. That you see visibly that they couldn't protect their own infrastructure. It sends a powerful message.
All right, we continue to watch the fires burning in what was Tariq Aziz's office. We don't know where he is at this time. Iraqi military spokesmen say a U.S. helicopter was shot down. We don't know whether that's true or not. That could be their own form of psychological operation, psyops for their people and trying to get a message out to the world. Saddam Hussein had been counting on a great wave of popular protest against this war that the United States would have to stop in place. It didn't work. On the diplomatic cycle, the president decided to go ahead and conduct the war with what they're calling the coalition of the willing, led by Britain and Prime Minister Aznar of Spain and the other countries that are providing some forms of support, more than 35 in all. But principally, the United States is conducting this military attack. Let's go to NBC Jim Miklaszewski at the Pentagon. Jim?
To follow up a little bit, Tom, on what David Kay was talking about in terms of the Special Security Organization, one of those targets hit, which is run by Saddam Hussein's younger son, Qusay. It is considered one of the most violent, repressive organizations, enforcement mechanisms within Baghdad. And as David said, this has to send a strong psychological message, not only to the rest of the Iraqi regime and leadership within the Republican Guards and Special Republican Guards, but to the Iraqi people. And again, I hate to go back to this, but it was clear in Defense Secretary Rumsfeld's press briefing today that the kind of targets that have been selected today and the kind of more incremental bombing campaign that we're now seeing, a serious change in the original shock and awe strategy, that it was by no accident that Secretary Rumsfeld today in his briefing, which is beamed through radio broadcasts into Iraq, was aimed at some of these Iraqi leaders. And that in the briefing for the first time, Secretary Rumsfeld admitted openly that the U.S. is talking directly with Iraqi military leadership, Republican Guard leadership, and Special Republican Guard leadership, all a part of the U.S. psychological warfare campaign to try to head off what appears now to at least be underway, the beginnings of a major war, an invasion of the U.S. into Iraq.
And specifically, what are you hearing about ground action, if anything? We're not hearing from our reporters who are embedded, so we presume they're on the move, Jim.
They could be, although it was thought that even there, that some of the assault on Iraqi ground troops in the south would be done in sort of a standoff position, that many of these U.S. forces wouldn't quite be rolling into Iraq quite yet, that they'd continue to pound those Iraqi military units with artillery and perhaps even airstrikes. But at this time, it is unclear to us anyway here at the Pentagon. We're just not getting that kind of detailed vision as to what's going on the ground in the south. It was thought that the air campaign and elements of the ground campaign could begin almost simultaneously, not necessarily a full-blown invasion across the Iraqi border, but certainly even between last night and today, we understand that there were some ground elements, perhaps some special operation forces inside Iraq doing the kinds of things you'd expect them to be doing, surveilling the military, surveying airstrips and possible routes for U.S. troops to take once they do get in on the ground. But it's not clear yet from here that a major ground invasion has begun or will begin soon, Tom.
All right, thanks very much, NBC's Jim Miklaszewski at the Pentagon. It's also worth pointing out that Homeland Security is a major concern now that the war is underway. Connecticut, New Jersey, and New York today formed a combine, as it were, a National Guard, state highway patrolmen, and local police to guard targets of opportunity in this part of America, bridges, tunnels, that kind of thing. Governor Rowland of Connecticut, Governor Pataki of New York, Governor McGreevey of New Jersey holding a joint news conference. There's a place called CENTCOM, which is just outside, just north and west of Doha in the country of Qatar. That's where Tommy Franks, we presume now, is huddled with his senior advisors, talking to the people who are running the command and control center, making the decisions about this war. NBC's Kelly O'Donnell is at CENTCOM, and she has some information for us. Kelly?
Hello, Tom. Yes, Tommy Franks is in his war room, which is separate from the Joint Operations Center, where he gets all of the information from computers and video conferencing and so forth in the field. What I am hearing on this end is similar and may in some ways complement what Jim Mikolashevsky is reporting. What I'm being told by multiple sources is that this is not the shock and awe phase of action, and that there is in fact a simultaneous ground attack and air assault. As Jim pointed out, it may not be full scale, but yes, in fact, there are ground forces and air forces on the move at the same time. It was also pointed out to me today to look carefully at what Secretary Rumsfeld said in his briefing today. And he said this is pretty close to a quote, that the force, scope, and scale that has never been seen before in referring to the kind of assault. They are telling me that it will be unmistakable, and the kinds of images that are coming in from Baghdad tonight do not meet that threshold. So that's some of the information that we're getting at this point. General Tommy Franks has been working throughout the evening, and it is, of course, nighttime here now, and we are getting some sense that there will be no briefing from this location, perhaps not even tomorrow. We were also told that this level of activity could go on 24, 48 hours, unclear, and that in his communication with the White House that the administration understands that when the military was given the go-ahead to execute this in their own way of determining what was best from a military strategy, that it may take this kind of time. We've also been told that the strategic surprise was so important to General Tommy Franks, and when there was so much discussion of shock and awe, this different kind of approach may in fact play into that. Tom?
All right, thanks very much, NBC's Kelly O'Donnell. One of the major considerations, of course, well, what they're going to do with the refugees, what they're going to do with the humanitarian efforts, which are going to be considerable. There are about 1 million children in Iraq who are malnourished on a daily basis. The United Nations is responsible for feeding about 13 million people a day under the so-called Oil for Food program, in which Saddam Hussein can export some oil. He gets in return food that's distributed to the population. There's an enormous black market that goes on there, but the impression strongly is that the proceeds from that black market goes primarily to the leadership of Saddam Hussein and his family. Otherwise, how could they support those grand palaces, those luxurious places, David?
Well, 2 of his sons are directly tied to the smuggling for oil, and Qusay's been involved in cigarettes and everything else smuggling. So the black market is clearly an official franchise. You don't enter into it unless you have someone in the inner circle as a partner. So yeah, that's there. I really do worry about both the refugee and the immediate relief issue. You've got a population that's lived under considerable stress for more than a decade. They're going to demand and need medical care and food immediately, and this is known by the forces moving in. And it's going to be a considerable drain on resources as they move ahead, particularly if this turns out to be longer than most of us expect it to be and more violent in urban areas than we hope it to be.
All right, let's go to General Monty Miggs now, who's over at the Telestrator, who's going to tell us about the shape of the battlefield, but also this whole issue about United States ground forces having to become policemen once they get to Baghdad. They're English-speaking Christians in a heavily Muslim country speaking Arabic.
This is a real problem. I'll talk about that. We'll zoom in here and take a look at Iraq and get a sense of the ground, and then we'll talk about this very, very important transition from combat operations to peacekeeping. I put this map up because it's important that people understand the synergy between air and ground, and the fact that we have these 2 no-fly zones here that the Air Force pretty much owns and has owned for a long period of time. So as a ground commander with my soldiers, or they were my soldiers and they were under fire like they were today, I'd want to get them out of those foxholes just as quick as I could. And so this area that we're looking at here may well be very easy to traverse and get in very, very quickly. And remember, we've talked along about the necessity to get across the rivers in a way that the enemy didn't anticipate and gets ahead of his decision cycle. And so what we're going to see, I suspect, is some very quick attacks up into areas that are strategically important. One of them obviously being the Western Desert. Another one, of course, the area around Baghdad and Tikrit. The quicker you can get there and surprise the enemy with the fact that you're already in his backyard adds to the shock and awe effect. Now, one of the very, very important things that General Wallace, General Abizaid, and General Franks are going to be worrying about is as the forces are coming up, you have to separate the factions. You've got to make sure that the revenge killings and that kind of score settling doesn't take over. You've also got to make sure that as these sites pop up that are suspected to have weapons of mass destruction in them or perhaps nuclear materials, you've immediately got to flex troops out, assess it, and secure it. And at the same time, when you get into the built-up areas, after you've had this fighting in the complex terrain, you have to do something we didn't do in Bosnia that we didn't understand, Tom, that goes to your initial point about our type of folks coming in and into a completely different country, a completely different neighborhood. In these countries, the black market is associated in by the secret security services. And it's a very important part of the control of the country. If the peacekeeping effort fails, as was done in the last administration, to attack that as part of establishing good governance, this can be very, very difficult. In fact, some of those remnants remain in Bosnia today, and we just saw the prime minister in Serbia was assassinated, most likely by representatives of this same type of connectivity that exists in Serbia still today.
And Monty, once they get to Baghdad, will they be bringing in MP kinds of forces, reservists who are trained specifically to do that, or are they going to have to put the combat people into those jobs?
With the amount, it's hard to know right now, but with the amount of troops we see on the ground at this point, the MP brigades are certainly going to be involved in that because they do have this law enforcement capability and they're trained for it. Civil affairs is going to be there, and I'm sure you'll see a lot of National Guard and Reserve civil affairs, and they will change the task organization to allow the combat soldiers to address this kind of problem. But one of the things we learned in Bosnia, when you have some bad actors, the way you face them down is you confront them with overwhelming force and they back off, you don't have a firefight.
All right, thanks very much, General Monty Meigs. A Navy veteran who is now the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, a longtime Republican power in the United States Senate, joins us now. Senator John Warner of Virginia, who was out in that region not so long ago assessing American preparation and force readiness. General Warner, what's your assessment of what we have heard from administration officials so far and what you're seeing on your television screen?
First, Tom, it's Petty Officer Third Class Warner, World War II veteran, people you wrote about so brilliantly. And let me tell you, these troops today are every bit as good as anyone that ever served in uniform in the United States, even a little bit better in my judgment. So we're here in the Congress going about our business, but right now I'm leaving to go to the floor to work with the majority leader and indeed the Democratic leader in managing the debate on an important resolution where the Congress recites its steadfast support for the Commander-in-Chief, our President, the men and women of the armed forces, their families, and I might add a number of civilians, most in federal service, who are in harm's way taking the risks in this cause to liberate Iraq.
Senator, we did have Senator Daschle on just a few moments ago. He's the Democratic leader who said earlier that he had been disappointed by the failure of the diplomatic effort. Overnight, he issued a very strong statement in support of the troops. But after his initial speech, there was some very sharp criticism of him by Republican Party officials in the House of Representatives, even within the administration. Do you think that that kind of acrimonious debate will now go away?
Tom, it's a matter of history. Working this morning with the Majority Leader Frist, we decided in the conduct of this debate that is history. At the moment, I hope all 100 United States senators unite on this resolution. We've worked it in consultation with Senator Daschle and the Democrats, Senator Levin, my counterpart on the Armed Services Committee, and I'm very optimistic that this important statement will reflect unity in the Senate of the United States.
I hesitate to bring it up at a time like this, but there is going to be a dollars and cents issue as well, and I know that that was on the floor of the Senate today. Some members of your party, as well as a number of Democrats, are complaining that they're not hearing enough about the cost estimates from the administration.
Yes. In meeting with defense officials, we anticipate next week the administration will submit a supplemental request to cover the operational costs that we foresee, and next week they should be spreading before the American public a clear factual case as best we can make the estimates for those costs.
All right, thanks very much, Senator
Thank
John
you.
Warner of Virginia, Chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, a veteran of World War II, former Navy Secretary. Let's go to the White House now. NBC's David Gregory. David?
Tom, we'll hear from the president in about 15 minutes. He will be meeting with members of his cabinet and will talk to reporters in a pool situation and a limited amount of reporters. White House officials telling us that the purpose of this is to rally the troops, both the troops within the administration and, of course, the American public. Officials have been saying that the president would not speak in a sort of minute-by-minute assessment of how the war is going. He wants to frame the issues as he did last night, but he wants to make it clear as he discusses the conduct of the war with his cabinet that there are other areas to focus on, domestic matters, homeland security, and it's a message that he'll emphasize to the public as well. One other point, in the past hour, Tom, officials have been stressing to me that part of what we're seeing in the middle of a lull over Baghdad at the moment is very much part of a theme, a sort of punch and stand back, surgical strikes. You heard Ari Fleischer in his briefing say something that was very important and something that officials are stressing, and that is that they would still accept Saddam Hussein to go into exile. You heard a similar point from Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld. They want to use enough military force to make the point that Iraq should give up the fight, should totally give up, or else the war will get harder and harder on Iraq. Tom?
All right, thanks very much, NBC's David Gregory. As he reported, we will be hearing from the president before too long in what is a pool arrangement. That is, several representatives of the very large White House press corps will go into the Oval Office with cameras rolling. The president will have something to say at that time. Whether he'll take questions, we still don't know. He does have a cabinet meeting scheduled for 2:30 today. He was awakened at 6 o'clock this morning by Condi Rice, his national security advisor, to give him an update on what happened overnight. They are still trying to assess whether or not they got Saddam Hussein. The evidence, at least to those people who are looking in, does appear that they did not, but he does have body doubles, and in fact the CIA is continuing to try to get a recording of his voice from earlier and then match it against the recording from last night. We're going to have continuing coverage here. I want to remind you that it is now coming up on 10 o'clock at night in Baghdad. About an hour ago, there was a lot of activity in the skies over Baghdad, and obviously American air attacks were successful on several key buildings, information installations, security leadership positions, the former office of Tariq Aziz, and now there is a pause. This is obviously a new kind of air campaign, as General Monty Meigs has been quick to point out and to emphasize that it's not just a fireworks show. It's designed to paralyze the leadership, to strike right at the nervous system at the very top of the Iraqi leadership, to give a pause and then to come back again with another wave of attacks that probably will be surgical the second time around as well. General Short, would you agree with that?
Tom, I do, and I think it's important to understand that in that pause, we're trying to assess. We don't want to go out and just blow things up, as you pointed out. We'd like to know how we did in the first wave. Do we need to reattack, or can we move to a second set of targets? So we're looking to get information from our overhead satellites, probably from Predator or Global Hawk vehicles, and from the pilots themselves. I've never met a fighter pilot who didn't think he hit his target, but we're asking for an honest assessment. Do you think you got it or not? Do we need to reattack or not?
Okay. Well, we want to tell you now that it's 2 o'clock in the eastern United States. It is 10 p.m. in Baghdad, and the people there are waiting for what they are sure to realize is more to come. They've been through 2 wars before, a long, costly war with Iraq, the invasion of Kuwait, Operation Desert Storm, and now a war that's coming right to their doorsteps. It is nighttime in Baghdad. The first stage of the air and ground war of Operation Iraqi Freedom is underway officially. This is the view from Baghdad with the skies lit up, the flash of explosions. 3 separate sites in that city appear to be burning. The bombing is expected to continue for several hours. Combat is intensifying as well along the Iraqi-Kuwaiti border. The U.S. 3rd Infantry Division has unleashed a barrage of artillery fire on Iraqi troops. There are reports of as many as 4 oil fires burning in southern Iraq. Presumably, they were set deliberately. There's also the intriguing question of whether it was indeed Saddam or a stand-in who appeared on Iraqi television just a few hours after yesterday's missile strike on a senior leadership bunker in Baghdad. Was Saddam killed or wounded? What about his sons Uday and Qusay? That, along with the tape, still is being analyzed at this hour. It's also worth pointing out that Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld at about 11:15 this morning came out to say that the war is underway, and then made a very strong statement to Iraqi military leaders and to the Iraqi people about there is no need for them to die on behalf of this outlaw regime. He urged them to put down their weapons, to stay in their homes. He told the Iraqi military leaders who carry out Saddam Hussein's orders that these are criminal acts, and he said there should be no setting of the oil fields afire, nor should there be any flooding of the valleys. This is the USS Constellation. What are we looking at there, General Short? Can you tell?
Tom, it looks like it's either an F-14 or an F-18. I just can't tell from the photography. Getting ready to launch, it would appear. Young folks underneath the airplane getting it set up. You can see what appears to be flashlights checking out the airplane itself for its integrity, probably checking the weapons. I just can't tell with old eyes, and there he is launching. F-18.
That's an F-18 Hornet.
Yes, sir.
One man up in the cockpit.
Could be a Super Hornet. Could have a 2-man crew, because the new Super Hornet the Navy has acquired has a number of 2-man capabilities. The Marine Corps has the same thing, and there are now Marine squadrons on a number of the carriers.
And what do they use the guy in the back seat for?
He works the radar. He works the weapon systems, much like the F-15E. As we have said in the past, guy up front rows the boat, guy in the back kills the ducks. So there's a division of labor in the front seat and the back seat.
All right, let's talk to a man who's flown off the carriers. That's your friend, Dennis McGinn, who is a former Vice Admiral, now retired, and analyst for NBC. Tell us about the capacity of these carriers that we've got at sea out there, Admiral.
Big changes, Tom, since the Gulf War, basically in the form of the number of strike platforms, F-18s, which we just saw launched off the deck of the Constellation, F-14s, and we have upped the number of strike aircraft to 50 on each of these carrier decks. 50 times 5 carrier decks, 250 combat strike aircraft, each of them capable of delivering a whole variety of precision-guided munitions. And one of the metrics that we could use in terms of creating that effect of shock and awe could be the number of aim points that a single carrier battle group could create in a let's say a day's period of time. It could be upwards of 500 to 600 individual aim points per carrier per day with precision-guided munitions.
Admiral, help me out. Where is the Constellation? Is it in the Persian Gulf?
It is. The Constellation is in the Persian Gulf, along with the USS Kitty Hawk and the USS Abraham Lincoln.
So how far does that F-18 that we just saw take off have to go?
It would be, depending on its target, it could be in the southern part of the country, a very relatively short flight. If it were going up north to Baghdad, it would be a little bit longer, in the vicinity of 350 to 450 miles.
And at that range, a refueling stop required in the skies over the target?
Normally, yes. We want to make sure that they go into hostile country, if you will, with a full combat package of ordnance and full fuel. It's a great joint success story, the way in which we've got the procedures and the training down for joining up Navy aircraft with U.S. Air Force tankers, getting up topped off on fuel, and heading into target with a full combat package.
And Denny, it looks like an EA-6 there, radar jamming aircraft getting ready to launch.
It does. That's an EA-6B Prowler, very, very critical to all of the air forces flying over there. This is what we call an electronic attack or electronic jamming aircraft. It can shut down communications, shut down acquisition and fire control radars in the Iraqi air defense system.
You don't want to go to war without it, is the way
Absolutely.
we view it.
One of the really tantalizing questions, of course, is whatever happened to a Navy pilot by the name of Scott Spiker, who was shot down during Operation Desert Storm and presumed to have been lost. His wreckage was then later recovered or spotted. There was evidence that he popped out. There were some witnesses who said they saw him There's been, within his family and within a very broad constituency of people now, a great hope that perhaps at the end of this war, Scott Spiker will be released from prison and will be able to return home. We just simply do not know, however, where he is. What about the recovery, search and recovery capacity that we have now compared to 10 years ago?
Tom, better joint effort. We use special operations forces if they're available. We now have dedicated Air Force capability. The Marines have a marvelous capability called tactical recovery of aircraft and personnel. We will have forces in Kuwait to do that. We'll have forces in Jordan to do that. Certainly we'd hope to have them in Turkey, but we're not going to have that option. But this is an incredibly dedicated group of young men. I will tell you, the fourth night of the war, the youngsters that went in and got that 117 pilot out of Serbia was a national success, because if they'd picked that pilot up, the Serbs had, could have been significant impact on the alliance cohesion. So they're just incredibly brave people that are prepared to go in and pluck these youngsters out of harm's way. And that's important for the airplane drivers to know that if we go down, there are men and women who are going to come and get us.
All right, thank you very much, General Short. Let's go back to Baghdad now to Peter Arnett, who is on assignment for National Geographic Explorer and also working for NBC News. Peter, what are you seeing in the skies? It looks pretty quiet from this end.
What is very interesting about the picture you are seeing, and what I'm seeing, Tom, is there are lights, street lights, building lights. In the Gulf War, in the first few hours, the lights of Baghdad were put out. The U.S. Air Force dropped some kind of chaff that shorted all the electrical lines. The lights on the Al Rashid went out immediately, all over town. But here, full lighted city. And this goes along with a Pentagon statement or information that from the Pentagon weeks ago that they would not attack the electrical grid. The Pentagon said they will also not attack the water plant process here, and there's water still in the hotel. So a very big difference in these series of attacks. I'm not saying that as these attacks go on, these may not be targeted, but so far, the people of Baghdad, they've heard the explosions, they've heard the anti-aircraft fire, but they're at home, looking at television or doing whatever they're doing with lights on and with water running, Tom.
All right, Peter, well, we have you on. We're going to roll some of that tape that we saw earlier. It was, about an hour ago now that the skies lit up with the air defense systems of Saddam Hussein.
Indeed, it was actually about an hour ago when sirens first indicated the approach of attack aircraft and missiles. We heard what we thought were a couple of planes go overhead, stealth bombers. They may have been cruise missiles, but two buildings just a mile away from us hit. One near the information ministry, which is, I believe, an intelligence headquarters. Another just in front of us in the presidential palace. Apparently, another major government building also hit in successive strikes was the former office of Tariq Aziz. It is still burning, Tom, and recently we've seen police sirens, trucks, and ambulances going to that building. Beyond that, explosions, 2 or 3 more around the center of Baghdad, of buildings we didn't notice. But for a whole hour after that, anti-aircraft fire, certainly to the western fringes of Baghdad. A lot of anti-aircraft fire. What they were shooting at, we don't know because we didn't hear explosions. Currently, though, absolutely calm city and virtually no traffic in the streets, but the lights are still on, Tom.
All right, thank you very much, Peter Arnett, who is in Baghdad. We just lost the picture there. We hope that we'll regain it momentarily. General Norman Schwarzkopf was the commander, memorably, of all Allied forces during Operation Desert Storm. He's now an analyst for NBC News, and he joins us. General Schwarzkopf, I don't know whether you were able to hear Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld earlier, but he made a very pointed appeal to the Iraqi military leadership and to the conscripts and the other members of the Republican Guard not to die defending Saddam Hussein, and warning them that if they carried out his orders, they would be tried as criminals. How effective do you think that will be?
I really don't think that message will ever get to the Iraqi troops in the field. I'm talking about at the troop level. It certainly gets to the level of the general officers. The general officers have a lot at stake, because the last time when they were defeated so badly, Saddam Hussein executed 5 of them, blaming the loss in Desert Storm on them. So on the one hand, they're facing a Saddam Hussein that's going to execute them if they do something wrong. On the other hand, they have to face the might of the attack that's coming. That's not a very nice position to be in.
Last night when you and I were talking, as a result of that unexpected start to this war with the target of opportunity, we began to talk about the so-called rolling start, where you have the air campaign of shock and awe. What are the dangers of a rolling start? It would seem to a layman, at least, that you really do raise the peril of damage from friendly fire.
Yeah, there's no question about that. We tried very hard in our campaign to make sure that we avoided civilian areas that we knew were civilian areas. But sometimes you had the civilian areas right mixed in with the military areas, and it was very, very difficult to sort it all out. And then, of course, we have the case where we had a major headquarters, one bunker one time that was being used also as an air raid shelter. We knew about that. That it was being used as a bunker, military command and control bunker, and we attacked it. And later on, found out, of course, that there was innocent civilians in there. So it's very, very tough sorting that sort of thing out at this stage of the game.
Well, not only civilians, but what about forces on the ground integrated with the people who are flying over their heads, who are on the same side?
Yeah, no, exactly. It's a very, very, very tough position you're in when you come up with this campaign plan from the air, because again, with all the precision and everything else, you don't have literally eye of the needle precision that you'd have to have, and then perfect knowledge of every location of their military also, to be able to pull it off with no casualties whatsoever on the side of the civilians.
General, earlier you were fairly outspoken in your criticism of Defense Secretary Rumsfeld based on your conversations with friends of yours who are still in uniform. You still have the same feelings?
Well, I think it's great to see that there's a meeting of the minds between General Franks and Secretary Rumsfeld, and they're working as a team now. As you have reported also, it hasn't always been that way, but now it looks like they are working and as a team, and he is respecting the military much more so than he was before. So I'm just happy to see that. I'm not by no means am I an enemy of Secretary Rumsfeld, nor do I don't even know the man. It's just that I was concerned at one point that he wasn't listening to his military advisors in putting together what was essentially was going to be a military plan that they, as military advisors, would be held responsible for. But I think that day is long gone.
All right, General Norman Schwarzkopf, we expect to hear a lot more from you in the next couple of days or so as this shock and awe campaign and the ground campaign begins to unfold. General Mike Short, how much pressure does that put on the air campaign when they know that they've got American ground troops who are moving simultaneously north as they're trying to hit targets just ahead of them?
Tom, this is a great concern, and if I could just take a moment to lay out for you how we think we're handling it. In the Gulf War, we developed a system that we called kill boxes that were geographical areas 10 by 10 or 20 by 20 in terms of mileage or kilometers, and we have worked that very carefully with the ground commander. Iraq is divided into X number of kill boxes. The ground commander is pretty much in control of whether we open a kill box or not. So we are able to get in contact with him. He will tell us, for instance, I have no troops in kill box Alpha Bravo. You're cleared to go in there and work interdiction targets. Or I'm in the southern half of Alpha Bravo, but you can't work the northern half, something along that line. And constant contact between the air commander and the ground commander to decide what area we can apply ordnance in. And then if we're in a close air support situation where troops are in contact, then we only drop weapons when we're cleared by someone on the ground.
But the fog of combat does take over.
Tom, it does. But we are extraordinarily sensitive to that situation. I can't tell you it's not going to happen, but I am personally comfortable that the combination of the kill box and the ground controller is about the best we can do at this point.
And General Monty Meigs is a ground commander. Do you share his confidence?
Well, it's an interesting irony here because one of the lessons of Task Force Hawk was that the rubbing surfaces between the Air Force and the Army and the working environment needed help. So one of the things we did in Europe with the help of Mike Short is every time we ran a big exercise, we took those two rubbing surfaces and mashed them together with as much sand as we could find between them to ensure that the Army commanders understood this process and knew how to advantage both their operations and Air Force operations in the air operation. Interestingly enough, those commanders are now down on the ground. Unfortunately, Mike and I have to sit here in the stands and watch them play.
We exercised with Scott Wallace. I was a senior mentor for a 5th Corps exercise a year ago in Germany and 6 months ago in Poland, working this kill box system and the air-ground coordination piece. It makes me feel good to see Scott Wallace and his staff in the fight.
Let me ask David Kay now, who is our expert on weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. The objective here is to disarm Saddam Hussein. If and when we get to Baghdad, everybody presumes we'll get there. What do you think we're going to find?
I think it will vary. I think in the chemical area, you'll find actual weapons and stockpiles of VX and mustard gas. In the biological area, anthrax is the most likely thing to find. I don't expect it to be in huge amounts, and a few warheads and aerial bombs weaponized on it. The nuclear area is going to be much more interesting. It's not going to be weapons. It's going to be trying to understand how far they were along in their process of production. We've had two recent very great shocks in understanding nuclear programs. The Iranian program popped up, and it's astounding at how far advanced it is, and we missed it, certainly in terms of its timing. North Korea is similar. So we've got a lot to learn, and this is an opportunity to look at suppliers, how they're doing it, and how they're hiding it from our intelligence assets.
In fact, the Iranians have really been able to fly below the radar. North Korea's gotten a lot of attention, Iraq's gotten a lot of attention, but there are the Iranians, full bore, building a plant, and with the help of the Russians.
Well, the Russian plant we knew about, and that's plutonium, and we were looking at it. The real surprise is it turns out they have centrifuges for making high-enriched uranium, 5,000 of them, a plant, and no one believes that's the only plant. We had no knowledge of it until very recently.
Do you share the belief of many members of the administration that if we take over Iraq and democratize it, it'll have a beneficial effect on Iran?
Look, there is a security dilemma that both Iran and Iraq are locked in. They're historic enemies. If you ask an Iranian, why are you developing weapons of mass destruction? They don't say the United States. They say because we lost 800,000 men in a war in the 80s with the Iraqis, and they used chemical weapons on us, and you Americans didn't try to stop them. I think the only hope we have in taking the Iranian program down peacefully is try to concoct a security environment that gives both countries security that the other is not pursuing weapons of mass destruction. Not easy, but the only peaceful option I see.
Thanks very much, David Kay. Let's go back to Baghdad now, where Peter Arnett has been hearing once again air raid sirens. Peter?
Yes, Tom. 3 minutes ago, there was a series of air raid sirens. They have now ceased. Whether that was at all clear, I'm not sure. I'm not sure they actually give all clears in Baghdad. But there were a series of sirens, and earlier in the evening, that was followed 5 to 10 minutes later by an attack. So we're waiting here to see if indeed the second wave of this evening is coming in, Tom.
All right, Peter, we are still struck here by the fact that you do have full power in the city, that Saddam Hussein has not turned out the lights, and that the United States has not taken out the electrical grid system.
Yeah, it is a very interesting factor that it hasn't happened. I'm just referring earlier to the debate over whether President Saddam Hussein survives. Earlier in the day, mid-morning, the ministers of culture and information gave a press conference. I've interviewed both of those men many times, and I asked them specifically, the Pentagon says it's killed your leader. Is he still living? And they both smilingly and jubilantly suggested that he was still alive. And they did not have the demeanor of men who had lost their leader, Tom. That small bit of information from me about you can put into the debate about the president's survival or not.
And the Minister of Culture is very close to him personally.
Yeah, Hamadi is indeed very close to him personally, and he was smiling at me, and I didn't get the impression he was in mourning, Tom.
All right, thanks very much. Peter Arnett, who's reporting from Baghdad. We were watching Italian television pictures. That is the former office of Tariq Aziz, a large ornate building, as they all are in a park-like setting, and it does appear that it is on fire. That's a building that has been hit on a number of other occasions. That would be a leadership target. It's very close to the Tigris River in Iraq, in the heart of where one of the presidential palaces is located. Also, the information ministry is not too far from there. Broad boulevards, a graceful city in many ways, David Kay.
It is a graceful city in many ways. Two river valleys really lend it to it. I think some of us regret that unlike many other Middle Eastern cities, in the 1970s and early 80s, Saddam Hussein tore down old Baghdad, which was a city of remarkable architecture going back to the Turk period and the Ottoman period, and that's gone. The replacement is, you know, it's nice, it's a little sterile. I prefer the Middle East as the Middle East.
And a little sterile is an interesting characterization of a lot of it is just a monument to Saddam Hussein.
Absolutely. I mean, the pictures I'd really like to be seen right now, Tom, are to Crete. I suspect Peter said he saw a lot of anti-aircraft activity to the west. Where he is, the way the city bends around, it quite likely may have been the northwest, and you may be seeing to Crete. I think early on, if you want to demonstrate to the Iraqi leadership a new day is gone, you take out to Crete, which is a city built by Saddam Hussein for his relatives.
Okay. There's an explosion. This is Italian television in the heart of Baghdad. And I'm sure that was a Tomahawk missile, don't you think?
I think so, yes. Because you're not seeing any anti-aircraft fire.
Right. Just all of a sudden, boom, it's gone.
Exactly.
That one looks like it went fairly deep because you're not getting a lot of explosion outside the building.
I think maybe the 1,000-pound penetrator that the Navy now has got is an option for them. You can see the picture there that we're showing, again, the range and the speed. Again, GPS guidance, and they show combined effects, but they also have a 1,000-pound capability. That all appears to be secondary explosions in that picture there that we're seeing.
Or another
hit, yeah.
Well, this is what we're witnessing in Baghdad right now is the lull after the storm and before the next storm arrives. This will arrive very much like a meteorological effect, wave after wave of fronts starting to come through Baghdad. There's another explosion there. What is that, detonation as it goes down through the building?
Absolutely, that as it hits. Could be a surface detonation, could be penetrating a couple of stories before it goes down, and quite frankly, could be secondary explosions. Could be fuel tanks, could in fact be ammunition stored in that building.
For those of you who are wondering about the civilian population of Iraq and collateral damage, the people of Iraq are very savvy about war, and there are not many of them who are going to be living around those kinds of buildings. First of all, they're not permitted to.
They're not permitted to, as first I'm going to say. That's an area you don't want to live in. In fact, many Iraqis don't even like to walk. It's too bad because it's a beautiful walk, actually. They don't like to spend any time in that area.
All right, that's the situation in Baghdad, where it is now coming up on 10:25 in the evening. It's going to be a very, very long night for the capital city. We can only wonder at this hour where Saddam Hussein, his sons, and his leadership may be located. David Kay mentioned a few moments ago the village of Tikrit. It's not really a village, the community of Tikrit. It's very near where Saddam Hussein was born. It is the home tribe for him. Most of the Special Republican Guard comes from that area because those are the people that he can count on. At one point, when I was talking to a senior American military planner, I asked him about the possibility of Saddam going to Tikrit, and he said, we just don't believe he has the facilities there. That if he goes there, that's not a bad thing for us because he doesn't have the same sophistication that he does in Baghdad.
I think it's the communication facilities he lacks. The presidential palace there's a lot of indication it has underground construction underneath. And so I think there probably are bunkers underneath you might get out of an attack, but the communications is certainly not the same communications you'd find in the Baghdad area.
David, aren't you astonished by the amount of construction that he gets done between wars and the time in which he gets it done?
Look, I saw the communication tower rebuilt. The communication tower, some of you will remember, during the Gulf War, you could look at it from two sides and it looked like a whole building. The cruise missile actually came in on the other side, peeled it back. They rebuilt it, added 300 feet, and put a revolving restaurant on top of it. But the most impressive thing to me, let me tell you, Tom, is we inspected a power plant in which had 4 turbines. 2 had been taken out. The Iraqis, in their own creativity, field stripped a turbine, a damaged turbine, and used it to repair one that had been hit. The U.S. producer of that turbine said it was impossible to do. The Iraqis did it in less than 6 months. They're a very talented and very motivated group of people. The largest middle class in all of the Middle East. There is real future for that country if the regime can be changed.
Especially in the construction trades and in engineering and the new technology. But the people on the streets of Baghdad, the only Middle Eastern city that you'll go to which you won't see cell phones.
Yeah, absolutely. They're prohibited. They're illegal. Also, you go through these waves, you can't have satellite dishes.
Right.
Illegal. Internet connections. They've not joined the internet world.
All right, thanks, David Kay. We are continuing to look at the scene in Baghdad recorded earlier of the explosion there. We are awaiting some videotape from the White House as well. President Bush is scheduled to meet with members of the press before he has his cabinet meeting at 2:30. Lots of cabinet meeting now, I'm told, has been delayed until 3. for reasons that we just don't know at this point. There are lots of items on the president's agenda. Primary among them, of course, his primary concern today is this Operation Iraqi Freedom, the successful execution of this war. And the war is only the opening phase, however successful it may be, because then the United States will have the daunting challenge of occupying a country, reorganizing it, running it, getting the humanitarian operation up and running, hopefully with the cooperation of the United Nations and the allies who decided not to join in the military action. That too is going to require some very skillful diplomacy, some patching up, if you will, of the rifts that have occurred as a result of the collapse of the UN Security Council effort and the decision of the president effectively to go to war with just Great Britain and other members of what he is calling the coalition of the willing, but it really is a two-pronged war. By the way, we were told that British warplanes, the Tornadoes, were involved in last night's strike.
I would expect that to be. I would think we would want a coalition effort, not just the U.S. doing something. We want the Brits to be along with us, as we do in the Southern No-Fly Zone every day.
We're just told now by Baghdad radio that one of the missiles hit one of his family homes, one of Saddam Hussein's family homes, but Baghdad radio is insisting that there were no casualties when it was hit. There are lots of targets when you start talking about Saddam Hussein family homes, because they're all over the city of Baghdad and out in the country as well.
You'll recall in Desert Fox in December of '98, we hit his daughter's home. The inside story of that is because it was well known that Saddam had a rendezvous with a not-so-young lady once a week in that home, and that was the day there. Another attempt to deal with command and control efforts very directly.
And I think that's the point to be made, that we're not just hitting Saddam's homes because they're his homes in some sort of retribution or lashing out. We're hitting his homes before we generally believe that they are command and control nodes. He's got command bunkers there and a capability to communicate, and we want to systematically take that capability away from him.
All right, let me just talk to our folks in the NBC control room here about whether we're hearing anything from our reporters who are embedded with the ground units. We've got people with 1st Marines, the 3rd Infantry, the 101st. We hearing anything from them? All right, we are not hearing from them at this time. You can draw your own conclusions about what that means. But the strong indications have been from the Pentagon and from the White House as well that the ground action is now on the move. Where and when we'll be able to hear from them, I can't say at this time. Momentarily, we're going to hear from Bill Arkin, who's a military analyst, who's with us as well. He's been watching these pictures of the sites that have been struck in Baghdad, and he'll be able to share with us some of his assessment of what is going on there. David, you spent so much time in the capital city. We do know that one large office building was Tariq Aziz's office. How much do the other members of the Leadership Council move around like he does, Saddam Hussein does?
They don't move around to the same extent. He literally spends a different night, every night in a different location to sleep. During the Gulf War, he randomly chose private homes. Also in the palaces that he has scattered around the country and around Baghdad. Full 3 meals every day, so if you're observing it, staring at it from space, there are no signatures that make it look like he is there or not there. An elaborate self-protection plan. No, I think no one moves as much as he does.
Tom, I'm struck by the clear signal we are sending to the Iraqi people by the fact that the lights are still on. As Peter said, the water is running. That's got to tell them that we're not out to hurt them, that we're after the regime and the leadership. This is a good thing for us to have done.
It's also a huge message to the Arab Street.
Yes. We're not causing your brethren to suffer.
That's right.
That's right.
We're going to hear from some people in the region in just a few moments, as soon as I'm told that we're going to be able to talk to them by telephone. Newspaper editor in Beirut, for example. We're also going to be talking to the defense writer for the Evening Standard in London. And we're going to be talking with someone from the French Institute for International Relations to see what the latest state of the relations between the United States and the so-called Arab Street may be, what's going on as well between the French and the United States, what happens to that alliance after this. we have in place now. Bill Arkin, this is all going to be very informal. You might as well get used to it during the course of the next several days because we'll be here. Bill is a well-known military analyst. You were watching those pictures coming in from Italian television. What were you seeing, Bill?
Well, like David Cade, I've spent a lot of time in Baghdad, Tom, and it's very clear that these pictures are taken from the Palestine Hotel, looking north across the Tigris River in a western direction. And you can basically see the standing Ministry of Planning and two buildings that are on fire to the east of that building. One would be the Presidential Secretariat building, which is the major office of Saddam Hussein's immediate staff. That would obviously be a very important and clear first target. And then next to it is what is believed to be the major headquarters of the Special Security Organization, the SSO. That's Saddam's sort of protective screen, and that's the organization run by his son. So what we see really are two buildings that have never even been attacked in 1991, and they were attacked very heavily in 1998, but they've been extensively rebuilt. And so really right now, I could make an argument that we probably have seen as many weapons land in this particular area of Baghdad as we saw probably in the first week or so of 1991 during Desert Storm. A very significant strike, and certainly one that is very much targeted on the immediate staff and the immediate protective and security apparatus around Saddam Hussein.
But Bill, let's talk for a moment about those people who are members of that staff and that security apparatus. They are cunning. It's unlikely, knowing that the war is coming, that they would have been hanging out in those offices.
It seems that what shock and awe actually is as it's unfolding here, Tom, is not that we're going to see some major attack, everything coming at one time, but sort of a more of a drip with a psychological warfare edge to it, hitting specific targets, hitting very directed things associated with Saddam Hussein, his inner circle, his security and protective screen, his secret service, his police squad, and that the end result of all of that will be that they will have nowhere to hide, or it provides the stimuli for them to move into places that are a lot less secure than when they normally would be. I don't think the hope necessarily, other than the attack last night, the first strike, is that in this strike tonight that there was an attempt to kill Saddam Hussein. But what it is now is that building is no longer available to them. Their files are gone. Whatever computer equipment in there is gone. Now they're operating from the back of trucks or from improvised facilities. And if this goes on for 2, 3, 4, 5 nights, as the United States tightens the noose around the perimeters of Iraq, moving its ground forces closer and closer in the south, we know that special operations forces are already operating in the west and in the north. What you have is really more and more pressure, which is trying to get the Iraqis to surrender or the Iraqi military to mutiny before an actual full-scale operation has to be taken. That would be the shock and awe that is different about 2003 than anything we've ever seen before.
All right, thanks very much, Bill Orkin. We've got an update now. The Kuwaiti news agency is saying that U.S.-led ground troops have taken the Iraqi border town of Qasr, which is right on the border, just across the border from Kuwait. We have believed for the past several hours that American ground forces are on the move. Iraqi diplomats say that 3 Iraqi diplomats based in Washington have been ordered out of the country by the United States State Department. The expulsions follow a pattern of the United States and around the world. The United States has been asking its allies to kick out Iraqi diplomats. We have an unusual situation here in New York. The Iraqi consulate, which is the home of Ambassador Al-Douri, you've been seeing him at the UN debates, is directly across the street from the private residence of Mayor Bloomberg in New York. So the mayor's security has been concerned about that for some time, but now nothing unexpected is likely to happen because there must be at least 6 television transmission trucks up there, police cars everywhere, and we don't know whether they're there for the mayor or for the Iraqi consulate, but as they say, only in New York. Let's go now to a man by the name of Les Skinner. He's Director of Well Control Engineering at Cud Well Control. He's based in Houston, Texas. He's one of the top oil well firefighters in the country, 30 years of experience in putting out oil well fires. Were you in Kuwait during Operation Desert Storm, Les?
Yes, I was, Tom. I was there for about, the end of the firefighting and then about 5 months of the post-capping effort, trying to get the wells back on production.
All right, we're looking at scenes now of 1991. I remember well, those were hellacious fires. We had to drive through the smoke to get to Kuwait City and then drive back through it again. The air was acrid and the fires took a long time to put out. Has anyone been in touch with you about the oil fires that we've been hearing about today?
We've just got the report from the news media. We do not have any sort of assets in the country to confirm that, but we understand there are at least 2 wells on fire now.
How do you put out an oil well fire these days?
We use some of the techniques that we've been using for years, Tom, but most of the time we end up spraying water on the fire, then we attempt to extinguish it using one or more of different methods of extinguishing, and then we cap the well, which means we put a new set of valves on top to control the flow.
And how long does it take you to do that if the fire is burning pretty ferociously?
It all depends on the fire. We've been able to put out some fires in a day's time, others it's taken several months. And the fires in Iraq, it's anybody's guess how long it'll take.
All right, thanks very much, Les Skinner, who is an oil well control expert. He has not yet been summoned by the United States government. Everyone hopes, of course, that the oil wells that are in southern Iraq, as well as in the north, will not be set on fire. Defense Secretary Rumsfeld saying again today, this oil belongs to the Iraqi people. The revenue from that oil will be a critical component in reconstructing post-war Iraq. They've got to use the money not only for construction, but for feeding the people and for getting it reorganized. That's going to be one of the many, many issues that will be sorted out, because there remains widespread suspicion around the world that the United States is going after Iraq to get its hands on the oil. The president has insisted that the oil belongs to the Iraqi people, but no doubt there will be arrangements made for American consumption of that oil as well. One of the most prominent of the Iraqi exiles, Ahmad Chalabi, has said that American oil companies will be brought in to begin to run the Iraqi oil wells. So that will be one of the many points of contention. There is, around the world now, a number of Iraqi exile organizations. All of them are beginning to maneuver as they have been for several years to try to get into position that once the United States takes control of that country, they want to begin running it. It's hard to overstate how complex a political arrangement that is going to be. I'm sure that Bill Arkin has some thoughts on that as well. How would you like to be running Iraq after the military take over?
Well, the administration of Iraq and the occupation of that country will be eased enormously if the United States' plan goes according to the way it's designed, which is to say not destroying Iraq, not having street-to-street fighting inside Baghdad, but getting the military first to recognize that it's all over, the regular military, and then second, so isolating the Special Republican Guards and the security apparatus that they will ultimately surrender, or that the Iraqi regime will try to leave the country, which I think is, by the way, the Kuwaiti, Saudi, Arab world hope, which is that ultimately an option which was put in front of Saddam Hussein before, which was going into exile, will be an option that is taken, which is preferable again to that final battle for the streets of Baghdad.
And David Kay, what do you think about that? You've spent a lot of time there. It seems to me that the real dilemma for the United States will be not in the first several weeks of jubilation and getting the feeding program organized and law enforcement organized. It's the political dilemma that comes, 6 months after we take the city.
I think that's exactly right, Tom. You've probably got 6 weeks in which you'll be given credit for the humanitarian and relief organization. 6 months later, if you find the Americans running the country, you're going to find you're running a country in the middle of the Arab nation. That's not going to be politically tolerable. The resistance will rise not only in Iraq, which is a very nationalist country, but also around the rest of the Middle East. So I think the transition is the most difficult transition is going to be from dominating the country. Hopefully, I hope Bill's right that we do it because the regime collapses and maybe flees and we don't have to go all the way to Baghdad by force. But when you make the transition from American military presence to some sustained other political presence, we're obviously going to need our allies there. The administration has already started. You heard the Secretary of State in the last 2 days speak about the necessity of broadening the international coalition for reconstruction, including those states that did not favor the war. We've got to make that.
David, we have some breaking news from Washington now. NBC's Pete Williams, who's been tracking the other war, the war on terror. Pete, what do you have for us?
Tom, good afternoon. NBC News has learned that law enforcement authorities in the U.S. are very anxious this afternoon to find a man that they think may be a top al-Qaeda operative and who could be involved in planning further terror attacks against the United States. Now, according to a nationwide law enforcement bulletin just out today to the nation's police departments, he's identified as Adnan G. El Shukri Juma, age 27, thought to be from Yemen and possibly Guyana. But law enforcement authorities fear he is, in essence, another Mohammed Atta. Atta, you'll recall, is the man that officials believe was the top planner of the September 11th attacks on New York and Washington. Now, this law enforcement bulletin that has gone out today to the nation's police says that the U.S. has information indicating that he may be involved in an al-Qaeda terror activity or terror activities and may pose an imminent threat to U.S. interests or persons worldwide. That is, both against targets here in the U.S. or American targets overseas. Now, the bulletin says there is no specific threat attributed to him, but they believe he's very much a key planner, and they're learning more and more about this man as the days go by, and have just recently discovered how important he may be. For example, he is thought to be a trained pilot, and in fact, one of his Arabic nicknames is Jafar the Pilot. U.S. authorities believe he was in the United States after September 11th, after the 9/11 attacks, and they don't know where he is. He could be here, he could be anywhere in the world, and they're hoping that they'll get cooperation from law enforcement authorities worldwide in trying to find him. But they put a very high priority on finding this man, El Shukri Juma, because he is a potentially key figure, they say, in any further plans to attack the U.S., and they say this information has been verified by captured al-Qaeda operatives who've been interrogated by the U.S., Tom.
Pete, let me ask you a couple of follow-up questions. How do they think he got in here in the first place?
They think he got in, well, he tried to come in legally. Now, whether he actually did so legally or not, they don't know, but he travels with a multiple number of passports from Canada, from Guyana, from Trinidad, from Saudi Arabia. He has a long list of aliases, and they say he is a very good English speaker. One investigator told me today that he speaks English with no Arabic accent whatsoever. And so he is adept at passing as someone from various parts of the world. So it's believed that he traveled into the U.S. Whether he did so legally or not, I don't know, because I don't know if he was using a legal passport and his real name at the time.
And Pete, he sounds pretty radioactive to me. Have they not been aware of him before just the past few days?
Well, they got on to him initially and put out actually one request to find him just in February. But he has so many names that they believe now the name they used at the time is not actually his real name. But they were on to him then, but now recently, as more and more top al-Qaeda people have been detained, as the U.S. gains more intelligence, they're realizing more and more how important he is.
All right, thanks, NBC's Pete Williams in Washington. Some very disquieting news as they continue the war on terrorism, both in this country and also in Afghanistan. There's a fairly major operation that has been underway in the last 24 hours in southern Afghanistan involving troops of the 82nd Airborne against some well-armed villagers. They went in and raided a village, but whether or not they were after a specific target or not, we cannot say. In fact, there was a knockdown of an early report that they thought that they had a bead on Osama bin Laden, but senior American security officials said that was not the case whatsoever. But that operation is going on even as the ground war now appears to have begun in southern Kuwait against targets in Iraq, and Operation Iraqi Freedom is clearly fully underway at this time. The air campaign of shock and awe is going to be as much psychological as it is kinetic, in the words of General Monty Meigs. A lot of it is designed to have an effect not only on the leadership, but on the people of Iraq, because one of the things that they want to be able to do when this is all over is have those people feel good about the United States and good about the liberation of their country, and not see us just as foreign occupiers of some kind. Let's go to Dana Lewis. We're hearing from him for the first time. He's with the 101st Airborne. Dana?
Hi, Tom. Really a roller coaster day here. You know, these soldiers over and over again have been called into the bunkers, in and out, gas masks on and off as we saw the first scuds coming in today. I can tell you that tonight we've been really hearing some rolling thunder earlier, thunder in terms of outgoing artillery just over the horizon from where we are. We asked the soldiers what they were, and we were told at the very least they were 155 millimeter howitzers pounding southern Iraq. We are also, it's being suggested to us tonight that, as you know, in 1991, some of the first units across the border in the ground war were Apache attack helicopters. It is expected that they will be airborne overnight tonight, and that they will be going after some of the Iraqi radar sites. So we're expecting them to fly. Tom, the weather had not been cooperating earlier. It was dusty, it was hazy, but tonight it is very clear. Clear skies and good visibility, so that will play to the advantage of any of the air assets that are striking targets inside Iraq. Tom?
All right, thanks very much, NBC's Dana Lewis. Dana, what about the mood of the troops? They've had this kind of roller coaster day in and out of those bunkers, wondering when they're going to begin to move. How are they holding up?
Frayed nerves, Tom. I mean, the first time it's training, people go in, and we've been here for drills over the last couple of weeks where many people, you know, you get in there and they start joking and they start talking. Today they knew it was the real thing, and one after another, it really gets on people's nerves. And one of my, the producer that I was with, she was in the bunker. I was standing outside doing talking live to the camera, but she said she looked over at one of the soldiers and saw some tears in the eyes. I mean, it can get on your nerves, and as people will not be able to sleep, and as this may go on, I think it gets even worse. What the soldiers are telling us is that, look, the sooner this gets going, the better for them. They want to move out. They want to do what they're trained to do. They want to go after targets in Iraq and get the job done. But sitting here is mentally a real test, because they are among the last units that may be moving into Iraq, and they feel that they're sitting ducks if Saddam wants to continue to fire some of these very inaccurate, unguided missiles, but missiles nonetheless that pin them in these bunkers every time these alarms go off. Tom?
All right, thanks very much, NBC's Dana Lewis. We heard from a Kuwaiti news agency earlier that American forces had taken the village of Qasr, which is inside the DMZ. Bill Arkin now tells me the former UN DMZ between Iraq and Kuwait. There you can see the small town. The American forces have been aligned all along that arc of the Kuwait-Iraqi border, and they're now plainly beginning to move north along there. From time to time, we're going to be getting world reaction from various authorities, political, journalistic, and otherwise. We want to begin doing that right now. We're going to go to London to Robert Fox, who's the defense editor for the London Evening Standard. First of all, I saw an intriguing item just a few moments ago, Mr. Fox, that Prime Minister Tony Blair is going to have dinner with Jacques Chirac, that he recorded a television message and then, flew off to Paris for dinner?
Yes, that's going to be an intriguing occasion to be a fly on the wall at, if you'll pardon my grammar. The Foreign Secretary, Mr. Jack Straw, has been pretty rude about the French again today. I think there are a lot of bridges which are very, very broken between Paris and London right now, because it's beginning to be sensed here in the UK that Tony Blair has made a big choice in going in with America. This is setting British policy, British stance in the world for probably a generation to come. If Britain is going to do things in the world that it wants to do, it isn't that it must be a broker or a mediator between the US and Europe. It's go with the USA, and that is the political message which is coming from Mr. Blair. And I don't necessarily say Mr. Blair's government, and certainly not from his party. And he's decided that he really must go with it on this one. And he does see, unusually for a Brit, a connection between the war against terror and the war against Saddam Hussein. And he's hung his reputation and his political future on it.
But if this war goes very well, the President of the United States will emerge triumphant. It will be seen as an American military victory. In his own country, will Tony Blair be given credit for that?
he will be given credit in the way he's being given credit already, but it's a personal credit. He's nominally the leader of a soft socialist government, and the soft socialists in that government really don't like his hawkish stance. And so I don't think he's out of the wood, but you are right, Tom. He's got to throw double sixes all the way down the line. They've got to get rid of Saddam Hussein. They've got to show there are weapons of mass destruction, and they've got to show that they can build a new Middle East out of a new stability in Iraq and the central area of Mesopotamia.
And Tony Blair has been speaking out more recently about some of the United States actions when it comes to the Kyoto Treaty, for example, the importance of the NATO alliance. Do you think that he'll have influence on his new good friend, President Bush, on all of these areas?
Well, that's the theory, isn't it? What's it going to be like in practice? Not sure about Kyoto, and I'm not sure how often the Lone Ranger in the White House is listening to his tonto in Downing Street. I think this is going to be the real proof for Tony Blair, but he is having some influence in the rest of the world. It's very interesting to see a very powerful British leader again. But the mood music is not playing well with Europe. You can see that now, and he'll be hearing that tonight at his dinner with President Chirac.
Thank you very much, Robert Fox, who is the defense editor for the London Evening Standard. We want to get now the reaction of Amatzia Bahram, who is in Israel. He's an expert. He's a professor of Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Haifa, and he joins us now from Tel Aviv. You saw those intriguing pictures of Saddam Hussein in his thick glasses and his beret and military uniform reading from a steno pad. You think that's the real Saddam Hussein?
Yes, I think so. I can't tell you with certainty of 100%, but I'd say 90% plus. I think this is Saddam Hussein. This is good old Saddam. I think I have accumulated more Saddam hours than most people I know. Believe me, it was not easy, but a man's got to do what a man's got to do. And seems to me that yes, this is him. That's him.
How do we expect Saddam Hussein to behave in the next 24 hours as this campaign of shock and awe unfolds against him specifically and his sons and his leadership?
I think that he already has indicated what his plan A, so to say, is. He is going to play the role of a victim. He must, within the next 24, 48 hours, produce a lot of civilian casualties for the benefit of the international and Arab television networks. He must. If he manages to do that, his hope is that the anti-war coalition in the West may still save him. But that creates a dilemma, because if he does that, then he cannot fire missiles at Israel, certainly not chemical missiles at Israel or at Kuwait or at the American forces or at the Kurds. So he must behave himself for 2, 3, maybe 5 or 6 or 7 days, because if he does use those missiles, if he does fire them, he's going to lose the sympathy of the Western anti-war coalition, and then he won't be saved, and he knows that. After that, when he realizes that they haven't helped him, if that's the case, then his hands will be free to use non-conventional weapons if he decides to do so, but not right now. At least it seems to me that he still relies on Western anti-war coalition to help him. And of course, if the Americans do not produce for him a sufficient number of civilian casualties, I think his choice tactic will be to draw them into battles in built areas where there are many, many civilians, and to fight behind the backs of his own civilians in the hopes that they will be killed in the crossfire, and then again he'll open the field for international TV networks. That, to my mind, is his plan A now.
Professor Bahram, I've been struck by the fact that the sharpest criticism of the United States military action has come from American allies, from the French and the Germans, and from American new friends like Russia. The Arab countries have been very quiet. That's a commentary on Saddam Hussein's standing in your part of the world, isn't it?
Yes, but I would say that certain Arab countries like Syria did and do criticize America very fiercely as the French do, maybe not much more, a little more. Certain Arab countries now decided, Arab governments decided that Saddam is beyond saving. And they are now blaming it on Saddam. They say it's his fault. The international community had done everything it could. There is not much we can do for him anymore. Some Arab states are even approaching him covertly, and some of them overtly, suggesting that he should be asking for political asylum. Yes, the Arab world is split basically down the middle.
All right, thank you very much. Professor Matzi Abaram from Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Haifa talking to us tonight from Tel Aviv. We now have the tape of President Bush in his cabinet meeting and meeting with the members of the White House press pool. That's the president sitting at the familiar center seat at the White House cabinet table. We do expect to hear some comments from him in just about a minute or so. So we're just going to ask you to stay with us. We'll also be talking with Senator Joe Biden, who is the ranking Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who has felt strongly that Saddam Hussein must go. He did have some difficulties with the diplomatic process that was executed by the United States on the lead up to the war. He had a lot of company in that regard, both in Washington and across the country. There has been a Senate war resolution today commending the President of the Armed Forces of the United States of America, sponsored by Senator Bill Frist, who is the new Senate Republican leader, John Warner, whom you heard from earlier. He is the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee and a World War II veteran, and Carl Levin, who is the ranking Democrat on the Senate Armed Services Committee. They worked this out as well with Senator Tom Daschle, who is the Democratic leader in the Senate, whereas Saddam Hussein has failed to comply with the various UN Security Council resolutions. Here now is the President.
Strategies to make the world more peaceful, to make our country more secure, to make the lives of our citizens as healthy and as prosperous as possible. We heard from Secretary Rumsfeld, who briefed us on the early stages of the war. There's no question we've set the finest of our citizens into harm's way. They perform with great skill and great bravery. We thank them. We thank their loved ones. We appreciate their sacrifice. We heard from Secretary Powell, who briefed us on the ever-growing coalition of the willing nations who support our deep desire for peace and freedom. Over 40 nations now support our efforts. We are grateful for their determination. We appreciate their vision, and we welcome their support. As well, we discussed the need to make sure we have plans in place to encourage economic vitality and growth. We will continue to push for a Medicare system that is compassionate for our seniors. We care deeply about the fact that some children in our society can't read. We want the best of education for every citizen in America. This cabinet is confident about the future of our country. We're confident we can achieve our objectives. I'm grateful for their service to their country. Thank you all.
Always the sound of the last question from the members of the White House press corps as they're ushered from the room, the President paying tribute to the bravery of what he called our finest citizens, the men and women who are in uniform, as he talked about the objectives of this war to secure the security of this country and also to free the Iraqi people. He then went on to say that this is an administration that also cares about reforming Medicare and pursuing its goals in terms of public education in this country. There was a very sharp debate earlier today on the Senate floor involving the cost of the war. They were debating the budget, but they have not had a request from the administration yet for the so-called supplemental. In this case, supplemental is a euphemistic term. This is going to be a very expensive proposition. There are estimates that run as high as $100 billion and could go even higher than that. It could run at the rate of $100 billion a day, and the meter is ticking even as we speak here. We want to tell you that we're about to begin another phase of our coverage here. Target Iraq. This is the latest at this hour. Operation Iraqi Freedom is now well underway from the air and on the ground. These pictures from Italian television show what may be the destruction of two key buildings, the special security organization run by Saddam's son Qusay, and the presidential secretariat run by Saddam's chief of staff. U.S. missiles are targeting several other command and control facilities in Baghdad as well. Meanwhile, along the Iraqi-Kuwaiti border, the U.S. 3rd Infantry Division is assaulting Iraqi troops with heavy artillery, also at this hour. In a scene that may be much like these from 1991, we're told that several oil fields in southern Iraq are said to be burning, deliberately set on fire by the Iraqis. It's not clear where Saddam and his sons Uday and Qusay are at this hour. And was that really Saddam who appeared on Iraqi television just hours after yesterday's U.S. missile strike on a senior leadership bunker in Baghdad, what was identified as a Saddam home? Or was it a stand-in? More and more people are persuaded, in fact, it was Saddam Hussein. In Washington, some important news on the war on terror. NBC News has learned that law enforcement authorities in the United States are very anxious to find a man who may be an al-Qaeda operative and could be planning further terrorist attacks against the United States. Authorities fear that he is another Mohammed Atta, the man officials believe was the top planner for the September 11th attacks. They do say, however, that as of now there is no specific threat attributed to him, but they realize that he may be extremely important in future plans to attack the U.S. And throughout the United States today, FBI agents are keeping very close track. In fact, they are questioning Iraqi American citizens and Iraqis who are here on visas of one kind or another. We're joined now from the Capitol by Senator Joe Biden, who, as I said earlier, is the ranking Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Senator, based on what you heard Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld say earlier and the President just a moment ago, what is your assessment of the situation and how the war is being executed thus far?
I think it's being executed based on the game plan they had in mind. I received a call last night from Secretary Powell telling me they were going to seek a, quote, target of opportunity. They made it clear that if and when that occurred, they would move. So I think it's going in a sense as predicted and as planned.
And the Senate today passed a resolution, or it has before. Have you passed it yet, or is it just before you?
It's just before us.
And all the Democrats going to sign on?
Oh, I believe so. My staff and Senator Dashell's staff were part of the discussions with the Republican leadership, and we agreed that this should be as straightforward as possible. We commend both the president as well as our forces, and basically acknowledge that we signed on to give him this authority. He's now the commander-in-chief, and we support him doing the job.
Senator, tell me about your email to your office. Are you hearing from protesters?
We are hearing from protesters, but I think the bulk of where the people in my state are right now are, look, we are where we are, and let's get the job done.
Should the administration be more forthcoming with the United States Senate and the House of Representatives and the American people, for that matter, about the financial cost of this war?
Well, yes, I guess the straight answer is, Tom, is yes. We know it's going to cost. My guess is they're going to send, as you said earlier, a supplemental, a euphemism for a request for somewhere between $75 and $100 billion. And there's some concern that it's not being sent to us now because we're in the midst of a budget debate that requires us to vote to allow room for this massive tax cut the president wants. And even without, there's not, in this budget we're debating, there's not one single penny allocated for the conduct of this war, but there is $750 billion or $680 allocated for a tax cut. And so a lot of us would like to see us deal with funding the war first and worrying about a tax cut later. And that's kind of in play here, Tom. But it's not about whether or not we support the effort underway or whether we support the troops or whether we question the president's being commander-in-chief now. But we would, it seems to me the more prudent thing to do is to figure out how to pay for this war, even though we don't know the exact number, before we go with a massive tax cut again.
Senator, you've spent a lot of your career worrying about the United States and Europe, the NATO alliance, the relationship with Russia. How quickly does that need to be patched up after the military campaign is over?
Tom, I think it's the #1 priority because, look, we need NATO, we need the rest of the world in dealing with North Korea, we need them in dealing with a lot of other things. And Tom, I hope that the president in the internal debate within the administration now about what kind of force, what kind of regime to have after this war is over, is settled. You have half this administration, sort of the Cheney-Rumsfeld axis, saying, don't get the United Nations involved, don't get the EU involved. And you have the other half of the administration say, no, this is an opportunity to bring the rest of the world in and help us take part of the burden off of us, as well as begin to, repair the fractures. And I hope we're smart enough to be able to engage the rest of the world in the post-Saddam era as we move for a transition government and not take it on all ourselves.
All right, thanks very much, Joe Biden, Democrat of Delaware, who is the ranking Democrat on the House Foreign Relations Committee. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you very much.
We're going to go to Qatar now, to the Central Command, which is just outside of the city of Doha. That's where General Tommy Franks, with his senior advisors, are running this war. And WNBC's Rob Morrison, who's also on assignment for NBC News, is with us now. Rob, what's going on there at this hour?
Well, Tom, the operational words here today are operational security. The military officials here say they aren't about to comment on any ongoing military operations for obvious reasons. It could jeopardize the security of the troops out there in the field. General Tommy Franks has been keeping a rather low profile since he arrived here in the region last week. And the first time we expect to see the general will be the first time he actually briefs the media here. I'm standing in front of the brand new $1.5 million media center, and that's where the daily briefings will take place. They haven't had one yet, and we don't know when the first one will be. There was sort of a natural order, a natural progression, if you will, that had to happen. We had to hear from the White House. We had to hear from British officials. We had to hear from the Secretary of Defense. And now that we have heard from all of them, we should be hearing about, from General Franks sometime soon here. There is a certain battle rhythm that they talk about here at Central Command. We've been seeing images from the front lines, and we've been seeing the pictures on our TV screens of the airstrikes and the missile strikes that have been going on in Baghdad. And as chaotic as it can be out there on the front line, they like to keep things calm and methodical here at U.S. Central Command. This place went to 24-hour operations just a few weeks ago for that precise reason, so they would be ready whenever the first shot was fired, so they could be into that battle rhythm, so there would be no surprises, because they say the sharper and the more focused they are here at U.S. Central Command, the safer the troops will be out there in the field. Tom?
Thanks very much, Rob Morrison. We're going to go back to Baghdad now, and Peter Arnett on assignment for National Geographic Explorer and NBC News. Peter's still pretty quiet in the capital city?
It is. There were sirens again 10 minutes ago, Tom, warning sirens, but nothing came of it. I guess you have a very nervous groups of radar people trying to interpret what they're seeing on their screens. They've certainly been seeing a few cruise missiles earlier in the evening. We had a recon by one of our acquaintances through the city a little while ago, and I can tell you that the building that we thought was Tariq Aziz's building was one right next to it. It was indeed the building, the office of Qusay Hussein, the president's son, who was recently put in charge of the
it's Fish. Hang on a second. I got to put you up.
Security and services.
Peter,
other than that, the situation is quiet here still. We're waiting to see if we can look at some of the other target areas to find out, to confirm what they actually were, Tom, rather than sort of trying to estimate that they're recognizing them from some distance. Back to you, Tom.
And is there any attempt on the part of Saddam Hussein to reestablish communication with his people after this morning's television appearance?
Look, we haven't been able to look at any television operations so far. I presume that hang on one second, as Iraqi, I'll talk to my interpreter and pal here, Kareem. Kareem, has there been any television programming tonight?
Yeah, there is television program. They put songs and march songs
Is there any statements from President Saddam Hussein?
Not yet.
So, Tom, there is television communications with the population. Earlier this evening, I did see the kind of propaganda material that you're very familiar with here, songs extolling the virtues of President Saddam and pictures of victory parades and so forth. The government has been promising some military communiques, something they did institute during the Gulf War. We haven't seen any of those communiques yet. I hope you understand that it's fairly chaotic conditions for us here. There's the hotel is in poor repair. It is certainly, as you were saying earlier, not the Al Rashid. On the other hand, it's a little more distance from the center of all the bombing that's been this evening, which makes it a safer place to be, Tom.
All right, thanks very much, Peter Arnett. We are fully aware of the difficulty of the conditions under which you are working, and we're grateful for you staying at your post. Retired General Michael Short ran the bombing campaign against Kosovo. You know what it's like to be in a command and control center when there is an operation underway. What's going on with Tommy Franks right now, in your judgment? And I recognize it's speculation, but give us tone.
I think right now, Tommy Franks is sitting and watching. He's got an air picture and a ground picture and a maritime picture. He's in constant communication with his component commanders, General Mosley, General McKiernan, Admiral Keating, and just periodically, how's it going? What are you thinking? Do we need to reassess what's happened in Baghdad? He's probably asking Buzz Mosley, how are things going in the Western Desert? Have we killed any Scuds? Do we see any movement on the J-STARS radar that indicates that there's some kind of a threat to Israel developing? Again, he's asking Mosley, do we need to reattack? What are your pilots telling you? The first wave is probably back. At least they're back on the tanker. They've used secure radios and reported. And quite frankly, he's searching for that catastrophe. The young pilot who released 2 bombs and didn't see them guide and never saw the explosion. They went ballistic. Boss, they went someplace they shouldn't have gone.
Well, we have a first-hand account now of the Iraqi-Kuwaiti border from New York Times reporter Dexter Filkins. He's going in with the troops in the next few hours to Basra. So I presume, Dexter, you're with what, the 1st Marines?
No, I'm with a photographer and another journalist, and we're on our own, and we're on the border here, and we're going to go in by ourselves.
All right, what are you seeing?
Well, we've just been witnessing the most extraordinary bombardment from artillery and from the air. It started about 4.5 hours ago, and it sounds like a terrible thunderstorm, and it feels like an earthquake.
And where is it? Over Basra?
4 hours. Well, I think it's all along, all up and down the border, probably all the way back to Basra, clearing the way for the troops that have already moved and have already gone across the border. We saw tanks today, and troop carriers and troops going across. And just a few moments ago, Apache helicopters came over. More trucks on the way, so they're just pouring over right now.
And the bombardment is a combination of steel on steel from artillery and from the air as well?
Yeah, I think it's mostly artillery. And I was in Afghanistan for the war there, and I have to say that this makes Afghanistan seem almost like a tea party. The amount of firing that's going on here just exceeds that by an order of magnitude. It's just extraordinary.
And what ground units were you seeing, without giving away positions or anything? Were you seeing Marines moving up or the 3rd Infantry going up? Do you know?
Well, it's hard. It was getting dark as they started to move. I think from what I could tell, they were U.S. Marines and British forces, and I think those are the units that are going to make a run for Basra, which is, as you know, it's Iraq's second city, and it's not terribly far from here. It's only about an hour's drive by car straight up the highway. And just today, as the sun was going down and the artillery was beginning, the tanks were just rolling through the border post.
You would be aware of some of the Tomahawk cruise missiles as they came overhead. I'm told that you can hear them from some distance off. Have you been aware of that tonight as well?
I haven't seen the cruise missiles, but I have to say that the number of different sounds, whether it's an explosion or something that sounds like a missile going overhead, or the rattle of machine gun fire, which I can hear right now in the back. It's a symphony of various sounds, and I think each different sound represents a different a bomb or a missile or a bullet going by.
All right, Dexter Filkins, I know that you've got work to do. Be safe, keep your head down. Thanks very much for that report. Dexter Filkins from the New York Times, who was in fact a veteran journalist of Afghanistan and nominated for a Pulitzer Prize for his coverage there. So it's now coming up on 11:15 at night in Baghdad. We've had one wave of attacks, selected targets. It's the lull after the storm and before the next storm that is fully expected. But as you heard from that report, there's a lot of activity down south, and no doubt between Baghdad and the Kuwaiti border and some of the key installations around the city of Karbala and other places, there's a lot of activity going on now. We simply cannot see it. Let's go to Dana Lewis, who's with the 101st Airborne. It's going to be one of the flexible units. They're going to be used for targets of opportunity, and they'll be moving around the desert. But when they go, we don't know yet. But Dana Lewis is with them. Dana?
Well, Tom, certainly the 101st Airborne is getting ready to go, and they have very much a solid, fixed battle plan in place, and they will fit into that big puzzle as the other forces, the mechanized infantry, move forward. But I can tell you right now, they are sitting quietly here. They are proceeding to take in some of their equipment. One of their ships was still at the port today unloading some of their transportation. Here at this base tonight, unprecedented security. They've strung more barbed wire. We even have passwords that we've been given when we passed sentries in order to get in and out, because they are worried about infiltrations across the border from Iraq, that Saddam may try to get people in here to blow up fuel depots or to try and damage equipment or try and get to some of those Apache attack helicopters. So a lot of security tonight. Off in the distance, we've been hearing some artillery being fired earlier. The big 155 millimeter artillery pounding southern Iraq. And just a short time ago, we heard some helicopters airborne tonight, likely the Apaches, and there is a very good possibility that there may be some Apache activity across the border if they go after some of the Iraqi radar sites, as they did in the initial early stages of the war the last time in 1991. Tom.
All right, thanks, Dana Lewis. Just stay in touch. We know that you've got a lot of activity directly ahead of you here. We want to introduce you now to one of the family members who's watching all of this. It's Cerinthia Olson. She's the wife of a chief petty officer on the USS Cook. She's in Norfolk, Virginia now. Her husband, Daniel Olson, is on board that ship. And Cerinthia, first of all, welcome. And I guess you are aware that your husband's ship was pretty busy earlier today. They were firing some of those well, I'm told that we don't have her now. That's the kind of the vagaries of live television that we'll be going through here for the next several hours. Just to bring you up to date, the air war is underway and the ground forces are moving. Artillery is being put down along the Iraqi-Kuwaiti border. It sounds like there's fairly heavy action in Basra, which is in the south. At one point, it was thought that Saddam Hussein had moved 4 divisions in there, probably regular army. He's pulled his Republican Guard and Special Republican Guard back to the capital city of Baghdad in what he hopes will be a very tight perimeter to protect him. How much he can be protected from American air power remains to be seen. It does appear that he survived the first attack, which came last night. George Tenet, the director of the CIA, went to the White House late afternoon yesterday, told the president, we think that we have a leadership command bunker. We don't know whether Director Tenet told the president that Saddam Hussein is in that meeting, but nonetheless there was an attack on that bunker last night by F-117s, 2,000-pound bombs. This morning, a man very much resembling Saddam Hussein appeared on television, thick glasses and a beret, not nearly as confident as he has been in other appearances. He called the small Bush, the president, a criminal, and he made several references to the Islamic faith. He does that for convenience and when it's to his advantage in situations such as this. So that's where we stand at this hour. The president is still in a cabinet meeting right now, and the United States Senate is about to vote on a resolution backing the American fighting forces as they go forward with this war, which is being directed from Qatar. Don Teague is in Kuwait City, where they had a couple of very anxious moments earlier today. Air raid sirens, people putting on gas masks, running for cover. Don, what's going on in Kuwait tonight?
Well, Tom, thankfully I can tell you it's very quiet in Kuwait City tonight, but as you mentioned, it was a very anxious day here today. We went through about a 6-hour span where just about once an hour those air raid sirens went off. In fact, at one point, the most recent, which was about 5.5 hours ago, was a specific chemical warning, which, as you can imagine, put everyone into a bit of a panic here. The good news is no injuries that we can tell you about. In fact, no direct hits of any targets in Kuwait City. The U.S. military, though, confirming that Patriot missiles did intercept 2 incoming missiles from Iraq, destroying those missiles, and they fell out in the desert away from any populated areas. Tom?
All right. Are they telling you anything there at the American Command Center about their worries about so-called asymmetrical warfare, not attacks from Iraq as they move forward, but terrorist activities as the United States empties out of Kuwait and begins to move into Iraq?
Well, that's certainly been one of the concerns here for the past couple of months. In fact, security has really tightened up here over, say, the past 3 or 4 weeks. Even the Seaflick area where the media gathers every day and where we get our information from the coalition forces on the ground, security is extremely tight there, and the Kuwaiti security on the streets is very tight. And today there were just random checkpoints set up all around this city. So we know it's a priority to try to stop that, and we know it's a concern that they have that that sort of thing might happen.
All right, thanks very much, Don Teague, who is in Kuwait. It was in Kuwait, of course, that when President George Bush the 41st went back for a triumphant visit after Operation Desert Storm, that Saddam Hussein organized an assassination attempt against the president and the emir of Kuwait, and it was for that the President Clinton had to then unleash an attack of retribution, really, against Saddam Hussein. That was unsuccessful in finding him or doing much damage long-term to the country. In fact, Saddam Hussein is one of the world's great survivors. It was President George Bush, the 41st, who said after Operation Desert Storm, "He walks amidst ruin, his war machine is crushed, his ability to threaten mass destruction is destroyed." That was on the 6th of March in 1991. Here we are a dozen years later, looking at the capital city and seeing him on television. Whatever else we think about him, he has been a canny survivor, David.
He's a survivor. Look, if you asked me 12 years ago, would I still be talking about Iraq and Iraq's nuclear program? I would have said no way. It's dominated over a decade of a lot of our lives.
Hans Blix said yesterday that he was deeply disappointed that the inspection program was not allowed to continue. How successful do you think it might have been had it gone on for another 6 weeks?
Tom, they would have found things, but they would not have gotten any closer to disarmament unless Iraq made the strategic decision to stop its deception and to give up its weapons. It's not a question of whether you couldn't find something. You just could not disarm Iraq. In the meantime, with his oil wealth and his program, he was moving ahead closer to better weapons, better chemicals, better biological weapons, and ultimately a nuclear weapon, a risk that was serious to run and that the inspectors really could not have prevented.
David, one of the striking things so far today is that we've not heard much from the Arab world, that the Arab leadership has not said much. I've not seen any reports of protests in the streets of the Arab capitals thus far. We want to get a kind of reading, if you will, on the Arab street from Rami Kare, who's a prominent Lebanese newspaper editor, and he joins us now by telephone from Beirut. Well, no, there he is on television. Before that is the presidential palace behind you, isn't that, Mr. Kare?
It's the Prime Minister's office, yes.
Yes, the Prime Minister's office. Tell us what the reaction is in Lebanon, on the street, and in the official councils to the military action that now has been unleashed by the United States and the so-called coalition of the willing.
Well, in almost all the Arab world, except possibly for Kuwait and maybe 1 or 2 other places in the Gulf, you have widespread criticism and condemnation and anger at this Anglo-American move. There are more voices that you're hearing privately, people saying throughout the Arab world, if this is going to happen, get it over with and let's get on to the next phase of our lives. But most people are very critical and very concerned, and also very angry about the inability of the Arab regimes and the Arab leaderships to have a more coherent stand.
And that coherent stand would be what? And it would not be in favor necessarily of Saddam Hussein.
No, not in favor of Saddam Hussein. I think most people in this region are sick and tired of this kind of police state regime, but we've had a longer legacy of suffering from Western armies coming in here since the Alexander the Great in the 4th century BC, and almost nonstop since then we've had Western armies coming in here and reordering and reshaping the region and bringing peace and democracy and prosperity, and it never really has worked. So there's a problem with Arab autocrats and there's a problem with Western imperial armies, and we really don't want either of those things. We want just a normal life, and this is what most of the people in this region are saying, and they're pointing to Turkey as an example of what is a good stand. You take a stand, you take a principled stand, you pay a price for it, but you come up you're standing on your feet and with your head held high, and people respect you more for it.
If the United States does in fact take control of Iraq, what will that do to the relationship between Syria and your country, Lebanon?
Well, I'm actually not Lebanese. I'm Jordanian Palestinian, but I'm editing a Lebanese pan-Arab regional newspaper, which is actually published with the Herald Tribune, which is owned by the New York Times, so we have great links with American press now. But there would be problems for regimes like the Syrians and the Iranians and groups in the Middle East that would feel that they are encircled by either American troops or very pro-American countries. And I think this is part of the intention of the American plan, to reorder the region with this kind of activity.
All right, thank you very much. Rami Khouri, who is the executive editor of the Daily Star, which he described to us very succinctly. It's a pan-Arabic newspaper that does have an association with the Herald Tribune, which is now owned by the New York Times. And Beirut, of course, is one of the great reclamation projects of the last 25 years or so. It was all but destroyed during the Israeli invasion, and because it was the headquarters of Yasser Arafat for so long. I was there for the Arab Foreign Ministers meeting. It was breathtaking to see the amount of reconstruction that has been done. A lot of money has come in, obviously, from the Persian Gulf to help with all of that. Their debt may be as high as $25 billion, but the Lebanese have always been very shrewd and very good businessmen, and they hope to make it what it once was.
Once the Riviera,
right?
At least
Exactly,
when
the Riviera.
We were younger.
That's right. But and whether it comes back to that or not, what we don't know, obviously, is how all of this will play out in the Middle East, how it will transform that region. There are, it seems to me, some very blue sky versions of what could happen in the think tanks in Washington among those who are supporting this military action. They may be, I think that it's fair to say, overtly optimistic about how swiftly the region will be transformed.
You know, I think that's true, Tom, but I think the untold story in the Middle East right now is in Jordan. You recall, Gulf War I, King Hussein took essentially a pro-Saddam view. His son, King Abdullah, has taken a very quiet but almost equally strong pro-U.S. view in facilitating it this time, and really gone to his people and said, look, Saddam is going to be gone. The situation on the ground is going to change. We must, for Jordanian interest, ensure that we're with the Americans on this. It's an extremely courageous view, and it's certainly facilitated what we're seeing happening in Baghdad and Iraq in the next week or two.
When I saw King Abdullah and his wife, Queen Rania, who is a very articulate, very modern young Arab woman.
Absolutely.
One of their major concerns, however, was that Jordan not be left high and dry when it comes to humanitarian assistance, because there will be refugees that come in there, and there are already Iraqis who are left over from the last war.
You know, the Iraqi connection with Jordan has been very interesting over the last decade. Essentially, they've gotten free oil from Saddam. So that's why it's even more courageous that they're actually standing against him now. They need assistance. They need not to be overwhelmed by refugees moving across that border.
General Michael Short, let's talk about the air fleet. We heard about helicopters being in the air, Apache attack choppers. We know that F-117s have been flying. What else has been launched?
Well, Tom, this is a real challenge for the commanders is to what we call deconflict the airspace, because we can't be in a position where we can just do one activity at a time and ground everything else. So for instance, if you and I were to look at a block of airspace now, as an air commander, I might say to my Army counterpart, okay, you own the ground from 1,500 feet on down. You can fly your helicopters there all you want. And to the maritime component commander, I'd say, I want you to bring your cruise missiles through Kuwaiti airspace in a block between 5,000 and 7,000 feet. And then again to the Army commander, I don't want your artillery going any higher than 15,000 feet, and fixed-wing air will fly from 17,000 feet on up. So I can deconflict the airspace, get a lot of things done at the same time, lift artillery fire as General Meigs would do when it was time to put in helicopters or fixed-wing air, but I've got to be very efficient in the use of the airspace and conduct multiple missions, and it's a challenge.
Here's something you'll be interested in. The Patriots did work, apparently, very well. They successfully intercepted and destroyed 2 tactical ballistic missiles during the attack on Kuwait at approximately 12:24 and 1:30 p.m. Local time over there. That was early this morning. We knew about those missile attacks. There had been reports that the missiles that the Patriots had worked.
Significant upgrade from 91.
Yeah,
really.
they're now Patriot 3s. I was out with some of those batteries, and the young captains and the others in charge were saying, we're going to hit them and kill them.
They are proud, good soldiers.
How much do those cost, do you know?
Oh, sir, Monty Meigs would have to tell you, Tom.
They're pretty expensive, but worth the price, Monty Meigs.
Mike doesn't like to talk about shooting down airplanes and missiles. This is something he doesn't want to have in his perspective very much. We're going to bring up a map here of the southern quadrant of Iraq and Kuwait, and I'll show you how this works to some extent. And really, this deconfliction of air defense, artillery, attack helicopters, and all the different types of air is a work of art. Well, let's say that we have an enemy Scud launching site here, and he's going to shoot at one of our units here. Now, we're going to have Patriots who have radar coverage out so that they can pick up the missile as it comes out. And the new Patriot missiles, as opposed to the first generation who had the technology to go and explode near a platform, actually now go and hit it right on the nose. And so they're much better. In fact, the radar's been upgraded. So the art of the thing here is when General Frank starts to move forces, what we want to do is keep moving the Patriots so that you can have them coming, you keep moving your range of where you're from out, and you constantly move that envelope out. Now, there's technology that lets the Patriot identify airplanes as they come through, and what Mike was talking about here, this isn't just an open block of airspace when the air boss gets done and chopping it up. If we've got blue forces here attacking, what the Army wants to do is come out in this general area with attack helicopters and come back. Now, this used to be a terrible problem for the air boss because he couldn't see the airplanes. We fixed that. We put technology on those helicopters that shoots their location up into the global command and control system, and from which the fighter pilots can bring that thing down and actually see in their cockpits where those airplanes are. And imagine how complicated this is. You've got fighters coming off of naval platforms, you've got fighters coming from Air Force airfields, you've got Apaches out there, you've got UAVs out there, and you've got this very capable air defense system that can knock any of them down, and it all has to be coordinated like an extremely difficult minuet.
And when you want to shoot artillery, Monty.
That's right.
To cover your forward advance.
That's right. So what'll happen is if the ground guy says, look, I have got to take out some targets in this area, what the air boss will do is basically create a great big column over that area, and the airplanes stay
clear
away.
everybody out.
That's right. This is especially a problem with MLRS, multiple launch rocket system, which you heard about the 3rd Infantry Division firing, because it fires for so far, it goes way up in the air. So the MLRS Block 1 ATACMS, I won't bore you with the abbreviation, it's just a rocket that goes 100 miles, is a real problem for the Air Force because it goes way up in the air. If you want to take out a radar site that deep and you don't want to send an airplane after it, that's a great platform to use.
Monty would like me to subscribe to the big sky, small bullet theory, but I refuse to accept that, and so I want to deconflict that airspace.
What happens once the ground forces begin to move? We know all along that border there are Bradleys moving, tanks moving, artillery pieces that are firing at the same time. You can keep track of it electronically, but only up to a point, right?
Well, no, actually, there's two interesting points here. I was sitting in the back listening to this, and I was twitching a little bit because, remember, the reports we got about units moving and people firing artillery are very old. So those reports occurred about the start of the campaign and were there. Now, those units have been moving for what? How long have we been on the air? About 4 hours, 2 hours?
Yeah, 4 hours.
Okay. If they average 15 miles an hour and they haven't run into anything and they aren't involved in any direct fire fighting, they're going to be 60 miles in. So those units could be already out here. And all these events are going on that we don't see because we get focused on all kinds of other things. Now, the interesting thing about what's happened with Army command and control technology, they developed a system called Blue Force Tracking. And so there's a sender in a lot of these Army units, probably down to platoon level, and Tommy Franks can see those units move in real time. In fact, if we were in the National Military Command Center, we could see it as well, because anything goes to the global command and control system is immediately available to any of the subscribers. That is an unprecedented new technology.
So, and the Air Boss has that same picture.
That's right,
Monty. So he knows where the ground commander is that he's trying to support. Incredibly important to him to keep real-time situational awareness of where the ground commander is.
We're going to see what Fred Francis is able to see for himself. He's in northern Iraq. We're going to go to him now. Fred? Can you hear me, Fred?
Yeah, Tom. Yes, Tom, I can hear you fine. The last 4 hours, extraordinarily quiet here. Just like all day, you're talking about 4 million people, all of them indoors or in the mountains. There has been some shooting along the Iraqi front line about 30 miles from me at various checkpoints, which have now been shut down. Iraqi soldiers earlier in the day fired mortar rounds into some of those checkpoints, but they were using it as a retreating position. We're getting news all through the day that Iraqi soldiers are defending and defecting, and we don't even have any combat up here per se. Air raid sirens have gone off in the city of Mosul, about 60 miles north of me. There are very few big targets there. The main Republican Guard division pulled out some weeks ago to move south to defend Tikrit. Particularly what we were seeing, I am told by sources here, is your classic rolling start. And it'll be going on like this for about a day and a half with light dusting bombing. But what we saw earlier this morning, I'm told, is the most significant degradation of the Iraqi air defense and communication system. Taj, the attacking of the Taj Defense Center 10 miles north of Baghdad took down the Chinese fiber optic system that controls much of the air defense around Baghdad. We are told that that Taji system is similar system in Basra was also taken down overnight. So all of those cruise missiles we saw had specific targets. The air package that was supposed to be targeted. The air package targeted for the first night of the bombing was actually used last night to take out these fiber optic nodes. They've left them alone in the last 4 or 5 weeks, giving the Iraqi General Command a sense that they could talk to their air defense systems and talk to their commanders. But sure enough, when those 3 dozen cruise missiles and other bombers came in, they took out the Taji fiber optic nodes, the one in Basra, and they have also, Tom, taken several airfields in the western desert of Iraq, and those airfields were designated to be jumping off points later in this rolling start for U.S. Special Forces and for airborne forces, which will have to be coming up to this end of Iraq where I am, since they lost the northern front and they can't move tanks down from there. But again, that's later in this fight, and so the situation in northern Iraq tonight is quiet but waiting. Tom?
All right, thanks very much. NBC's Fred Francis in northern Iraq tonight. As the United States began its military campaign, there were a number of protests around the world. We want to make note of those now. In Cairo, the Arab world's biggest, largest city, obviously, riot police used water cannon and batons against hundreds of rock-throwing protesters who tried to storm the U.S. Embassy. There were also strikes in Italy today, trade unions shutting down for 2 hours. Italian cities were thrown into chaos as tens of thousands of protesters took to the streets in that country. Silvio Berlusconi, who is the Prime Minister of Italy, is really one of the president's strongest supporters in Europe. In Germany, more than 80,000 school children, many with faces painted with no war or peace signs, protested in the capital of Berlin and the cities of Stuttgart, Cologne, Munich, and Hanover. Spanish police in riot gear fired rubber bullets at anti-war demonstrators, including some well-known Spanish celebrities. Spain, obviously, with Prime Minister Aznar, is one of the principal allies in Operation Iraqi Freedom. Let's go to NBC Jim Miklaszewski now at the Pentagon. What do you have for us, Jim?
Well, Tom, we can tell you that senior Pentagon officials tell us that, in fact, the shock and awe campaign is underway. It may seem now, given the pause in bombing of Baghdad, that it's shock and pause. However, these senior Pentagon officials tell us that at any time, the bombing in Baghdad, specifically targeting high-value leadership targets, could resume and is likely to resume at any time. In addition, we've heard about thousands of U.S. infantry troops now pouring across the border from Kuwait into Iraq. Serious artillery battles. The town of Qasr apparently taken by the 3rd Division. That's in the far southeastern part of Iraq, at the very tip down there at where Iraq meets the Persian Gulf, and that these operations will continue off and on now for the next several days. One senior official said, "Think flexibility." After each individual component of this operation, military operation, they are going to pause, take a look at what they've accomplished, what they have left to do, and then reassess the battle plan from there. Tom?
All right, thanks very much, NBC Jim Miklaszewski. As you were saying all of that, General Michael Short was giving it a thumbs up.
Tom, this is what we've been talking about. This is not about quantity bombing. We're not trying to level Baghdad. This is about quality bombing and quality movement on the ground. We have effects we wish to accomplish, and it really has nothing to do with destroying a lot of targets. It's destroying a limited number of the right targets, and as Mick just said, assessing how we did the first time out. We're in no hurry here. We don't have to get this done in 12 hours. We own the skies. We can work around the clock. We want to hit what we need to hit, not hit what we should not hit, support the ground commander as rapidly as we can, and move this thing along with, quite frankly, minimal damage to the other side. So this is a good, smart effort so far.
We're going to go to Washington now. Republican Senator Chuck Hagel of Nebraska, who's on the Senate Intelligence Committee, a combat veteran of Vietnam, a man who had a lot of reservations about the diplomacy, or more accurately, the absence of it going into this military operation. Senator Hagel, I know that you, with Joe Biden, went out into that region and spent a lot of time going around to the capitals, up into the northern Iraq area and so on. What were you hearing about what else the United States needs to do in the Middle East?
Tom, first of all, I think it's important, as you have been emphasizing in your guests, the complexity of this region, especially in northern Iraq, where Senator Biden and I were in December. You've got the Kurds, the Syrians, the Turkmen, Turkey is on the northern border, the Iranians are on another border, and it's important that we keep that northern Iraq together. That part of Iraq is going to be an essential part of keeping Iraq in some kind of a federal republic, I think, after Saddam is gone. And the potential for a lot of problems up there is serious. But if we were told by the Kurds the United States stays steady and works with the Kurds and the others in the northern Iraqi area, and the Turks essentially stay out of that area and no military presence, then I think we can bring this together.
The president has reintroduced into his public discussions in the last few days the Israeli-Palestinian issue. Is he going to have to go right back to that as soon as the military operation is completed, in your judgment?
It is my judgment that the Israeli-Palestinian issue is woven into the fabric of everything that goes on in the Middle East. I don't think you can decouple that from anything. Now, we may, in the United States, not accept that or agree with that, but the fact is all the Arabs in that region do believe it's part of the equation. I think most of the Muslims around the world think it is part of this issue. We are going to have to get back on it, Tom, and I think we're going to have to get back into the roadmap effort in a way that's not just words, but in fact working with our quartet partners there to move this forward, because until we see some progress on that front, I think we're always going to have some difficulties there. Not the only problem, but it's certainly a big one.
And what about the tone in the United States Senate, not only with across party lines, but within your own party now that the war is underway?
Well, this is a somber, serious moment up here. Certainly all of us, whether Republicans or Democrats, are supporting the president, supporting our troops, supporting their families. We'll have a resolution passed shortly to put the United States Senate on record in supporting our efforts. The debate about why and when and who with and all the rest, that's over. We are now at war. We have a mission to accomplish. We'll have a lot of work to do when that war is over. We're going to need a lot of allies. We're going to need the United Nations. So, yes, it's serious, but we're confident that our military, being the best in the world, is going to do a terrific job, and we all hope and pray that this will be over soon with a minimum of casualties.
All right, thanks very much, Senator Chuck Hagel, Republican of Nebraska, who is a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee. It's been an up and down day on Wall Street. We're going to get a report on that now from Tyler Matheson at CNBC. Tyler?
Tom, you're exactly right, but the good news really is that U.S. stocks have been comparatively stable for most of the day. The blue chips, the Dow Industrials, right now up about 27 points at 82.93 or thereabouts. Chip stocks have been doing very well. Among the Dow stocks, Intel, the best performer there. Over at NASDAQ, a barometer that's usually even more volatile, pretty much stable today, higher by 8 points at 14.05. The real news has been in the gold and, as you might expect, crude oil markets, where crude prices are down about $1 a barrel, in the $28 a barrel range. They were spiking higher earlier in the day, Tom, on those first reports that some of the Iraq oil wells had been set aflame. The traditional safe haven financial asset, gold, is now at 4-month lows, down $4.10 per ounce today at about $332 per ounce, as people have sort of taken heart with what they seem to be thinking is going on in the Middle East and Iraq. Tom?
All right, thanks very much. Tyler Matheson from CNBC giving us an update on the economic situation. I'm joined now in our NBC News Situation Room by Regita Durgam of Al Hayat newspaper. She's one of the most highly regarded Arabic journalists who works out of the United Nations. Regita, what are they saying at the UN about its place in post-war Iraq?
They're starting to speak only about the role of the United Nations through the Oil for Food program, which is the humanitarian side of it. And of course, it's about Iraqi oil. It's there's about $9 billion in the pipelines, and they're trying to find out how to use it to aid the Iraqis, refugees outside the country, and Iraqis stuck inside, with, of course, Secretary General Kofi Annan emphasizing repeatedly that the responsibility normally goes to the country that is occupying another country, and that is presumably he means the United States.
Do you think that the United States can close one chapter at the United Nations and reopen another one on the humanitarian issue?
I think that's what the United States will try to do, but I think the shape of the Security Council and its role in the world in the future will be determined later by the administration. After all, the United States will be essential for the continuity of the Security Council if it were to be of any importance, but I believe that will be determined later. Right now, there has been so much division, so much fighting, and right now people are thinking that this war, or the majority of the Security Council were saying up till yesterday that there is no legitimacy, international legitimacy for this war, so there is a big difference there.
Regita, we've been talking some today about the Arab Street, so-called. None of the Arab leaders really are speaking out against the war. There were massive demonstrations, I gather, today in Cairo. Do you think that most people have mixed feelings in the Middle East about what's going on here, not happy about the United States coming in on these terms, but happy to see Saddam Hussein go?
Very much so, Tom. You said it, and it's really a painful moment, no matter how many people say that it's the fault of Saddam Hussein for having brought on Iraq what has happened or is happening to Iraq. This is a painful moment for all Arabs, because after all, this is Baghdad being bombed. This is Iraq, the country, the very important country, being almost, on the verge of occupation. There is, unfortunately, as much as there is distrust of Saddam Hussein, and maybe people are relieved that he will be out of office, unfortunately, there is not as much confidence in the United States yet. A lot of people have been still questioning what are the real motives behind this war. Unfortunately, they do not believe or buy what the president says, that this is a war of liberation, that the whole idea is to go into Iraq and help the Iraqi people. Right this moment, they're concerned about casualties, about innocent civilians paying the price of whatever is going on.
All right, thanks, Brigida Durgam, for being with us, an old friend. Brigida Durgam is one of the most highly regarded of the Arabic journalists who is working at the United Nations, a special correspondent for Al Hayat. Sirens in Baghdad, so we're going to go back to the Iraqi capital city. And as we watch that picture and listen to what is going on in the skies, we're going to bring in now the new Senate Majority Leader, that Senator Bill Frist of Tennessee, who before he took that job was very concerned about Homeland Security, especially the threats of bioterrorism. Senator, with this war underway, are you confident that we're prepared in this country to deal with that threat?
Well, Tom, we are much better prepared in this country than we were a year ago. The whole prevention, preparedness, and the investment on behalf of our federal government, coupled with the great work in local communities, means in this country we are much better prepared. Saddam Hussein may well use chemical and biological weapons on our troops there, and they are very prepared, I think, in terms of both vaccines, inoculations, and appropriate equipment, and how you use that equipment.
I think it was the mayor of Baltimore, however, who said we cannot deal with Homeland Security with the proceeds from Firehouse Bingo. Mayors and governors across the country, Republican and Democratic alike, are looking to the United States Senate and the House of Representatives for a whole lot more help. Are they going to get it?
You know, they will continue to get it. We have gone from not putting very much money in to up to $3 to $4 billion, and that will be sustained over time. It does take time to develop that infrastructure to be fully prepared for chemical and biological weapons. You have to train the personnel. We see today in terms of smallpox that not as many people in terms of healthcare providers have received that smallpox vaccine, and not until they get fully inoculated can we as a nation be prepared in the event that smallpox is used, because they're the ones who are going to be inoculating us. So we have a long way to go to be fully prepared, but we are much better prepared than a year ago.
The president called you on the telephone today, I gather.
He did.
What do you have to say?
Well, the president, as you probably have heard, is very resolute. He is solemn in many ways because he knows the huge responsibility that he bears as commander-in-chief with our nation's men and women today fighting for us. But I would use the word resolute as the tone in his voice and what he says. He is very confident. He recognizes that there are risks. He has done everything humanly possible in terms of diplomacy and to minimize that risk, and thus is ready to accomplish that goal of regime change, and I'm confident we will do so in short order.
Are you going to be able to pay for this war and give the president all the tax cuts that he wants?
Yes, we will. You know, our growth package is very important if we are to fulfill the obligations of our country in terms of health care, in terms of Medicare, prescription drugs, Social Security. So I think we do have to have tax cuts and an appropriate growth package. At the same time, I know next week we will see a huge supplemental, what's called a supplemental bill, and that will fully fund, I believe, two things. Number one, Homeland Security, the sort of issues we just discussed, as well as pay for this war.
All right, thanks very much, Senator Bill Frist, the Senate Republican leader, for being with us today.
Good to be with you, Tom.
Thank you. We're going to go back to Peter Arnett now, who is still at his post at the Palestine Hotel in downtown Baghdad, watching the skies, listening for air raid sirens. Peter still looks pretty calm from here.
It is pretty calm, Tom. The authorities, the police, firemen are still fighting this fire, and the complex that houses Uday Hussein's building. Uday Hussein, of course, is the president's favorite youngest son. He runs the intelligence services, security services, and is in charge of the defense of Baghdad. That compound adjoins Tariq Aziz's former residence and also a cabinet ministry, apparently also seriously damaged in this attack. Now, just a few minutes ago, Tom, a series of sirens again. Now, whether this was an all clear or nervously awaiting a further attack, we don't know. Basically, for the last hour, the city has been quiet. No anti-aircraft activity at all. But I was listening earlier to your program from Jim Mikolashevsky. He said that the Pentagon has told him these attacks could come any time, and I think that the residents of Baghdad and the authorities here are aware of that, and they are on full alert. Tom.
All right, thanks, Peter Arnett. We're going to ask you to continue to stand by there. We're going to go to Pittsburgh now. We have on satellite General Barry McCaffrey, who led an armored assault across the Iraqi and Kuwaiti desert during Operation Desert Storm, and he joins us from there now. We know that these troops are on the move, the 3rd Infantry Division, which effectively replaces what you were doing, I guess, 12 years ago, doesn't it, General?
Yeah, it does indeed. You know, Tom, if you can just visualize this, it's pitch black out there. There's 1,000 or more armored vehicles, 3,000 or 4,000 wheeled vehicles. They're moving in complete blackout conditions, night vision goggles, and while they're moving, they're engaging enemy forces on the move and nailing them at 3,000 meters. Over them is this entire structure that Mike Short and Monty Meigs were describing. So from an Iraqi perspective, utter chaos, violence in the dark, and from the other side on 3rd ID, they're the first army in history that actually knows where they are in the dark.
All right, General McCaffrey, we're going to go to the Pentagon right now because we've got a report of an Apache that has gone down. Mikolashevsky, what do you have for us?
Tom, U.S. military officials reporting that a 2-man crew aboard a U.S. Apache helicopter reported taking enemy fire apparently right along the Iraqi-Kuwaiti border. Don't know the exact location, but then the Apache just suddenly lost communications. There is a search and rescue effort apparently underway now. Don't have many more details, but this crew in this Apache helicopter did report taking enemy fire and then simply just disappeared. The search is on.
Well, that is the price of war, obviously. We're going to talk about that some now with Monty Meigs. The president was making clear in his remarks, other administration officials, including the defense secretary today, the American people have to be prepared for losses.
Well, that's right. If you're going to take the calculated risks that are required to fight this kind of a campaign, let alone any campaign, you're going to have to put soldiers at risk. Now, the airplane we're talking about, the Apache, moves by stealth. Its great value is its tremendous firepower and its ability to move stealthily in and around the battlefield. Any helicopter is vulnerable to small arms fire or machine guns if you just happen upon an enemy unit. Interesting thing about the Apache, it's got a very survivable crew compartment. The crewmen have survival radios, much like the Air Force and the Navy. They'll beacon up so that as soon as they hit the ground, we should know where the Apache is, we should know where the pilots are, and immediately there will be an effort to go police those people up. If they're healthy, we strap them on the outside of a helicopter and fly them out. If they're not healthy, they'll send a medevac vert in to get them.
General Michael Short had a very high-profile experience with all of that during the bombing campaign against Kosovo. You had a 117 go down. You had a pilot who managed to elude captors for how long was that?
Tom, 6.5 hours, and I would tell you personally the longest 6.5 hours of my life. There you are, a 3-star general. You think you're in charge of things, and in fact, you're watching while great young captains and staff sergeants go in and get that young man out. And if my voice breaks, I'm sorry, but I can still remember it. It was intense within my headquarters. You could hear a pin drop, and I'll never forget the call when we got the young man on the helicopter. The helicopter commander called and said, "I've got an Eagle on board," and the place erupted because we had to get out of harm's way. Extraordinary stuff.
Now, the advantage we have on this one is they're back behind our lines, and so if the guys are healthy, it should be fairly easy to pick them up.
And Monty's guys will probably do a self-pickup as opposed to dedicated Air Force SAR assets going to get them, but it's an important mission, and you want to bring your kids back.
Let's take 2 seconds to talk about the Apache for a moment. That, too, has been greatly improved in the last, 5 years or so in terms of its capacity to fire over the horizon and to see all the way around it.
That's correct. That big bulb you see on top of the rotor head is really a very advanced radar and thermal sight. And the Apache can look out. This is actually an A model, not the D model that has the bulb. But anyway, you can look out, big range, see lots of targets, and have other helicopters shoot for you.
All right. We'll be hearing a lot from Monty Meigs and General Michael Shorten and from my colleague David Kay. NBC News coverage of the war in Iraq will continue, anchored by my colleague Lester Holt. I'll see you later for a special one-hour edition of NBC Nightly News. The war is underway.